All right. Well, it is 9:01, so let's get started. On behalf of the senior leadership group of the NIH Obesity Research Task Force, I'd like to welcome you to our symposium on the global impact of obesity. We're very much looking forward to hearing from our distinguished speakers who, and fitting in well with our theme of the global impact of obesity, are coming to us from 3 continents: North America, Europe, and Africa. Before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. We will be recording today's symposium, and we hope to make it available for viewing. Once it is posted, we can let the people who registered know how to access that. We are going to have time, we hope, for questions and answers after the talks. What we ask is only the people who are speakers are able to actually unmute. However, we do ask that you go to the chat box and put in any questions or comments that you would like read to the speakers during the Q&A. So others will not be able to see your questions. So just be aware of that. But do put them in. You can put them in at any time during the talk, but we'll ask the speakers to address them at the end of the talk. If you're having any technical difficulties with seeing or hearing the presentations, you can put that in the chat, but you can also, there's an email. The first email in the chat right now is the email address of Mr. Mark Dennis, who you can let him know if there are any technical problems. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Griffin Rogers, the director of the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases, who will be providing welcoming remarks. Dr. Rogers.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Yanowski. I hope everyone can hear me. I want to bring the exciting and diverse field of obesity research to the attention of the NIH community, and to provide opportunities for learning about cutting-edge research and engaging in discussion. Sharing the latest expertise of these series provides really important information on the state of the science and research opportunities for the scientific community. The task force holds 2 seminar series each year, covering a broad range of topics to accelerate the development of new and innovative treatments for obesity and to close knowledge gaps. The NIH supports a range of basic and applied biomedical and behavioral research with the goal of translation into more effective personalized care. And today's seminar topic, the global impact of obesity, is obviously a very important subject and a matter of international public health significance. The epidemic of obesity in adults and children is obviously not limited to the United States. Obesity prevalence is increasing globally and can coexist with malnutrition and stunting. And while treating people with obesity-related comorbidities can overwhelm healthcare systems, some countries' health care or political system allow for creative and integrative approaches to obesity prevention and treatment. And so this seminar will explore the global impact of obesity and what lessons the US and international communities can learn from each other. For today's seminar on this compelling topic, we are fortunate to hear from 6 very distinguished speakers to discuss research on the global impact of obesity. In the first talk, Dr. Jonathan Wells will provide insights on the evolution of human adiposity and obesity. He'll be followed by Dr. Francisco Branca, who will describe his research on the dual burden of obesity and malnutrition. Dr. Laura Dugas will then present her research on sleep timing, gut microbiota, and the cardiometabolic risks across the epidemiologic transition. Dr. Marcela Nunez-Smith will go on to discuss obesity and cardiometabolic cardiometabolic disease in Eastern Caribbean population. She will be followed by Dr. Franco Sassi, who will speak on a multi-country approach to childhood obesity. The Science and Technology and Childhood Obesity, or the STOP project, in European countries. And then finally, Dr. Bill Dietz will then close out our scientific presentation by discussing the global syndemics of COVID-19, obesity, food insecurity, and climate change. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank today's speakers for sharing their important research and our viewing audience for attending this virtual symposium. And I'm quite sure that today's talks will generate some very lively discussion. So once again, thank you for attending. And with that, let me turn the virtual mic back over to Dr. Yanofsky. Sue?
Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers. We very much appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today and set the stage. Now, I do need to ask if our first speaker, Dr. Jonathan Wells, is here.
Dr. Wells has not come on yet.
Okay. It sounds like Dr. Wells can present at 12:30. I'll just put that in the chat. And I know he has a very interesting talk. I know that everyone is looking forward to. So if you can stay on at 12:30, please do so. We can start our first talk of this morning. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Francesco Branca. Dr. Branca is director of the Department of Nutrition for Health and Development at the World Health Organization in Geneva. He graduated in medicine and surgery and specialized in diabetology and metabolic diseases at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, Roma. How did I do?
Wonderful.
He obtained a PhD in nutrition at Aberdeen University. He was a senior scientist at the Italian Food and Nutrition Research Institute, where he was responsible for the design and implementation of several studies on the effects of food and nutrients on human health at the different stages of the life cycle, and for the design, management, and evaluation of public health nutrition programs. He was a president of the Federation of the European Nutrition Societies from 2003 to 2007. And Dr. Branca will be addressing the dual burden of malnutrition. Dr. Branca.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Yanofsky, for the comprehensive introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be invited to join you today with this conversation. So I'll start by saying that we have relatively recently agreed that we have to deal with a series of malnutrition challenges. This is what we call the 6 global nutrition targets. They were agreed by the World Health Assembly in 2012. They're not in numerical order because I grouped them to say that the first 3, 1, 6, and 4 are dealing with children under 5, the different aspects of malnutrition of children under 5, stunting, wasting, and overweight. Then we believe that low birth weight is an important nutrition conditions to be addressed. Anemia in women of reproductive age, and breastfeeding. Inadequate breastfeeding is one of the key element responsible for the burden of disease. So the fact that in 2012 the World Health Assembly recognized this was changing a bit the narrative around malnutrition, which until then had been focusing maybe separately in 2 communities on stunting, particularly stunting, and that had attracted attention of donors, policymakers, and then in another small separate community, the challenge of obesity, but particularly in adults. So bringing them together was a relatively new thing, and this is a slide taken from the 2014 Global Nutrition Report, the first edition of that report. And you see there, this is a number of countries that have multiple forms of malnutrition. So that was, in a sense, an obvious finding, but seeing it together was giving an important message. And that report was saying, well, multiple forms of malnutrition is the new normal. And that was also the time when we had convened the second conference of nutrition, which also took on that narrative. And then the reason why we have now a Sustainable Development Goal agenda, which talk about multiple forms of malnutrition, is exactly because we have that understanding. But in reality, the concept of the double burden is not a new concept. I mean, it has at least 20 years, and I really would like to recognize the fantastic work of Barry Popkin, in which he's particularly been looking at certain parts of the world where these two conditions seem to coexist. So we decided to bring together a group of people to somehow review the knowledge about double burden of malnutrition. So I'll be telling you a little bit about this series of papers that we published on the Lancet in 2020. Barry Popkin was the first author of the first paper dealing with the epidemiology. Jonathan Wells, by the way, is the first author of the second paper dealing with the biology of the double burden. Then with Corinna Hawkes, that has led on a third paper on the response to the double burden, and a fourth paper by Rachel Nugent on the economics of the double burden. But going back to the definition, so the double burden of definition in this context has been defined as a coexistence of undernutrition, and by that we mean different forms: micronutrient deficiencies, underweight and childhood stunting and wasting, and overweight and obesity, and diet-related non-communicable diseases. So the definition is pretty comprehensive. Although in operational terms, we have only been able to describe part of these elements, because our knowledge about macronutrient deficiencies is not such that allows us to combine data about macronutrient status and anthropometric status in all populations. So the analysis is mainly done on the anthropometric data. And similarly, the diet-related non-communicable diseases, and particularly the exposure to unhealthy diet, is something that you are sort of paradoxically, after so many years, we're not able to do that to do that efficiently. And so having really a comprehensive assessment for each individual on all these parameters is something that we're not able to do. So but I think the fact that we at least are saying there are elements of deficiencies and elements of particularly excess adiposity is something that is the key message that we want to convey, talking about the double burden. And in the context of this series, we have talked about double burden in three ways. We said you can have a country level double burden of malnutrition. In other words, a coexistence of multiple forms, but in different communities. For example, in different social strata, in different geographies, but in the same country. So, this is, of course, a public health challenge. If a Minister of Health has to do something, what would he do? I've just come back from Rwanda, and yesterday I met the Minister of Health, and he's focusing on stunting. Rightly so, they have 33% of stunting. And I said, but Minister, actually, you also have 26% of women with obesity. Okay, we take note of that. You see, so that is clearly, an enormous challenge for fragile health systems, that find it difficult to cope with what needs to be addressed in multiple ways. But we'll come back to that. Second element is household level double burden of malnutrition, and this is sort of getting different. So you may have in the same household different forms of malnutrition. Sometimes it's a mother and a child. Sometimes it's two siblings that have different nutritional status. And the third one is individual level double burden malnutrition. So an individual may have multiple forms simultaneously, or may have multiple forms at different stages of the life course. But let me give you some numbers. Again, definition here for the country level prevalence of the double burden of malnutrition is high prevalence of undernutrition. So we said more than 15% wasting in children, or more than 30% stunting in children, or more than 20% thinness in women, and high prevalence of overweight and obesity in adults and children. And we defined somehow three thresholds: 20%, 30%, or 40%. So you see, these are operational definitions. You can argue about that, and I'm sure that there are very good reasons for one or another definition. So, but this is the analysis of the double burden of malnutrition defined, as I've just said, and looking at two periods: the decades of the 90s and the decade of the 2010s. Basically, the most recent data we have. So you see, there are the high-income countries, by and large, are not affected. And so, this is a lot really targeting low and middle-income countries, particularly middle-income countries. There has been a shift, but you see, there's basically a large amount of the world population. We're talking about over a third of the world population, which has this combined conditions. Barry did a very interesting analysis, and in really looking at the quartile of income, and demonstrating that, particularly if you look at the top and the middle one, the 20% and 30% adult overweight prevalence, there has been a shift. So some countries are no longer having a double burden, but some are beginning to have a double burden. And this shift is particularly taking place in countries in the lower quartile, of income distribution. So the sort of the middle income, the low income countries, they're the ones who are developing more and more the double burden, and particularly because while they've not been able to reduce the undernutrition at a sufficiently fast pace, overweight has come in, has kicked in. And so they're sort of putting this new problem on the old one. Now, the household level prevalence, I mean, how is it defined? You can have, in a child, which is both stunting and overweight, or you can have a mother overweight and one of the children wasted or stunted, or a thin mother and one of the children overweight. And, we don't have the time to go into detail, but it's actually interesting to see, what do we know about these different components. I mean, we're using, in general, as data sources, the DHS surveys and other household surveys here. Oops. Again, here, time comparison and an income element result. So you see, this is a regression on the household double burden of malnutrition on gross domestic product, gross domestic income, and you see that in the recent part we have more countries which are in the middle income. So there is, the modeling shows that we have a curve. So particularly high income countries, they don't seem to be affected, but the middle income countries are. And again, this is because of the increase in the prevalence of overweight. What happens in an individual child? And we have multiple combinations, but I'm showing here the combination of stunting and overweight in the individual child. We have some time trends. Also, we're able to look at data sets that are perhaps 20 years old and most recent data sets. And in some cases there is a decrease. In some cases there is an increase. I think again it goes with income. But you see, it can actually be pretty high. If you look at China, for example, where 10% of the children have this this combination, stunting and overweight. So stunting is there, and overweight is kicking in. I really would have liked to have Jonathan here to comment, but I was trying to see if we could also look at the longer term effect. So in other words, if a child is born with low birth weight or develops wasting and stunting, is that child going to be more likely to be an adolescent or an adult with overweight, obesity, and a metabolic syndrome? And here, and I apologize, we really have not done a systematic analysis. So it's a series of elements. There's actually quite a lot more. So I think this is definitely worth a more systematic analysis. But if you look at a bit of the more traditional literature, such as the South African, the Johannesburg Birth 20 cohort, we need to look at cohort studies, of course, to be able to give the answer here. And in that cohort, they were unable to find evidence that stunting by itself in early life predisposes to obesity during the pre-pubertal years. Although in South Africa, it's actually quite interesting, because you see that you have a lot of stunted children, and then suddenly you have in adolescents a lot of adolescents girls who are overweight or obese. But anyway, they didn't find a connection there, and also in Jamaica, they did not find a relationship between early stunting and later obesity in prepubertal children. Okay, so this is actually the shorter term. So they didn't, this cohort that have not been looking at the longer term, the adults. I've recently found a few other studies. There's another study in South Africa, the Limpopo study, in which they were actually looking at children at 3 years of age, and they were 6 more times likely to be overweight if they had been stunted, if they'd been wasted, low weight for height, Z-score at birth. Interesting finding. They were challenged to say, well, actually, it could be because of the way we calculate obesity, and the height element is somehow giving a wrong message. So we shouldn't be doing just the anthropometry like this. We should be doing better body composition to be able to test this hypothesis. I found another longer-term cohort, is a European cohort, a Portugal cohort, in which there is a positive association between short stature in childhood and obesity for women. Note, this is a longer term. So this is obesity in women, and it's a pretty good odd ratio. It's about 2. Now, what is the story here? One potential story, which I think it's documented by a series of metabolic studies, is that depending on the modality of growth, that can lead to increased risk of metabolic syndrome. So particularly the early rapid postnatal weight gain. So if there's a rapid catch-up growth from the stunting and the wasting, this is where the risk of central adiposity, insulin resistance, and metabolic systems actually appears. So I was trying to start thinking about, what should we say about intergenerational pathways? So we know that if we have a low BMI and or low height in the mother, the risk of low birth weight and or prematurity is increased. In a low birth weight child, there's a higher risk of wasting and stunting. Wasting or stunting or both. And we know that in the longer term, these individuals will develop a greater non-communicable disease risk. Now, what happens with a child who has been wasting and stunting? I mean, from the studies you have seen, it can actually go into direction. You could go in the direction of still keeping that loop, intergenerational loop, and girls would become mothers with low BMI, low stature, and I will reiterate this loop of malnutrition, this trap. But there is also a possibility that actually this develops, and this of course depends on the environmental context. It develops into high BMI, and then we have, depending on the nature of the high BMI, depending on the associated condition, for example, the presence of a gestational diabetes, that high BMI actually can lead to macrosomia. So you see that can actually go in a different direction. But I do believe that we need to be better at describing these elements, because I think that the double burden of malnutrition needs to be seen in a life course context. Just to close on the epidemiology, what's happening now, this is the latest analysis we have done on the levels of trends of child malnutrition. The yellow line is the stunting percentage on the left and numbers on the right. The blue is the obesity, and the red is the wasting. We don't do wasting trends, but we're working on the wasting trends. But the wasting line is a bit fluctuating. It's not going up or down necessarily. So you see the stunting has been going down. We've had, unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has created a little bit of a hump in that decrease curve. So we'll lose ground in the long term. But it's going down with a lot of variability. And obesity is slowly, progressively going up. No way of arresting it. And this is children under 5, remember. So in general, this picture would tell you, yeah, it is likely that we continue to have double burden even more. Also because this is the global trend. But then if you look at regional or national, you will find different rates of improvement or not. Why is double burden of malnutrition happening? This is very paper showing is it economic growth that might reduce wasting, stunting, and thinness, reduce physical activity, increase purchasing power. But food system are transitioning, are changing. I think you'll hear in another presentation about that. Food marketing and access to certain highly processed food is increased. There are shifts in control of the supply, urbanization, women's employment. This is actually all transitioning towards highly processed food, which are not addressing with better quality nutrition product the stunting challenge. By the way, stunting challenge is also related to other elements such as poor water and sanitation and access to healthcare. And so the food is not getting the right nutrients, getting excess fat, sugar, and salt, and that is what is generating the obesity without addressing the pre-existing malnutrition condition. With Corinna, we thought that we should give the message that it's not an either or. It's not that either you address stunting and malnutrition or you address obesity. You actually need to address both at the same time. We've used the term double duty action. So there are some public health actions that can actually address both undernutrition and overweight. And this is a list, but this needs to be done by the health services through social safety nets, in educational settings, and in agriculture, food system, and food environment. And just to give a couple of examples here, breastfeeding and adequate complementary feeding, adequate infant nutrition, that is indeed a double duty action, because that would prevent both the undernutrition and the development of overweight, or anything that related to the early food environment. Protecting children from the harmful marketing of food, that is definitely something that would curb obesity and would actually facilitate the improvement of their nutritional status. And another one is school food procurement, and having healthy school foods would definitely be an important double duty action. But as I was saying, this is something that needs to be communicated public health operators. It's not something which is even given for granted. The economic analysis also shows that double burden is going to put increased burden, double burden on countries, and indeed having double duty actions may be an important saving. So I'll stop here, and maybe there's time for a couple of questions. Back to you.
Great. Oop, my video. There we go. Thank you so much, Dr. Branca. That was really a fascinating talk. And I'm just going to ask a question that I was really intrigued by, this coexistence of stunting and overweight in the same individuals. And, you know, I think that this probably would be considered consistent with the Barker hypothesis, that nutrition during gestation, particularly early gestation, might predispose to later obesity and cardiometabolic disease through multiple pathways, including impacting the hypothalamus. And if you believe that this is the case, should we maybe be focusing our efforts on getting adequate nutrition to young women, teens, and young women who are likely to become pregnant? Would this be a way to get good bang for the buck?
No, thank you, Susan, for the question. No, I think first of all we need to understand the natural history of these conditions. Now, if you look at South Asian children, I mean, South Asian, the Indian babies particularly, a fourth of them is born with low birth weight. So this is clearly a very common condition. So I do believe that early epigenetic influences are going to be very important. And so we do have to do better in maternal nutrition. But if you look at African children, actually the proportion of low birth weight is much lower. We are maximum in the order of 5-6%. And the stunting is actually developed in the first months of life. So it is a different dynamic. Now, stunted children do have some metabolic differences. For example, in their capacity to oxidize postprandial fat. I think that's an important mechanism. And then if these children are exposed to an environment, an urban food environment, where in fact the foods are high in fat, for example, I suspect that could be a quick way to store adipose tissue, without making the best use of that energy. So, so the answer is yes, we should be looking at maternal nutrition, and definitely a life course approach to nutrition is critical. But let's also consider that not all stunted children have the same history. And so the kind of, but in terms of actual public health intervention, that doesn't change much, because we still have to promote, protect, and support breastfeeding. We still have to make the food environment, particularly in urban areas, a bit more conducive to healthy diet.
Hi, I'm going to read a question from the chat. This is Leila Esposito from NICHD. The question is, how do you define thinness in women? Is it below the normal BMI cutoff, or is it something else? Yeah, that's correct. It's a BMI below 18.5 kilogram per square meter.
Hello, Dr. Branca. This is Sonia Artiaga with ECHO program in the Office of the Director at NIH. So a question, you presented 10 double duty activities. Are there any plans to implement these activities and evaluate them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's certainly something that comes. For example, WHO has developed guidance on the health interventions, the nutrition intervention that should be included in the primary healthcare packages. And of course, the double duty actions are included there. When you say evaluation, I think that probably is a point where we can do better, because we're not looking at the implementation of these actions versus the reduction of the double burden. So even if we're somehow formulating the concept of the multiple forms of malnutrition, they are analyzed separately. So I take your comment as a suggestion actually to build in the evaluation of healthcare service delivery, also this component of the double burden. So, not just looking at, how are we reducing stunting, what are we doing for anemia, what are we doing for obesity, but are we actually able to address them simultaneously? When we were trying to do the analysis of cost effectiveness of programs, we had a hard time actually to find well-evaluated programs that could tell us whether this was a good idea or not. The only kind of studies we've seen are school studies. So in the school context, it is possible to have an understanding of what's happened to the double burden. But absolutely, point taken, we need to do much better job in evaluating the double burden.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments from the members of the audience? All right. Again, thank you very, very much, Dr. Branca, for a really interesting and important talk. And we can then move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Lara Dugas.
Good morning. I'm going to start sharing my screen now.
Okay, can I give my introduction?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
I'm excited.
Dr. Lara Dugas is the AXA Research Chair in Non-Communicable Disease Epidemiology at the University of Cape Town and is an Associate Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Public Health Sciences, Parkinson School of Health Sciences and Public Health at Loyola University, Chicago. She received her doctorate in exercise physiology from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. In 2007, she joined Loyola University, Chicago, and completed her master's in clinical research methods and epidemiology in 2011 and her master's in public health in 2013, both from Loyola University, Chicago. As the project coordinator on a large international study investigating the effects of diet and physical activity in 2,500 adults of African origin, she became interested in the role of intermediary metabolites, including metabolite profiles and short-chain fatty acids derived from the gut microbiota and chronic diseases such as obesity and diabetes in populations of African origin. And she'll be speaking today about her work in sleep timing, the gut microbiota, and cardiometabolic risk across the epidemiologic transition. Dr. Dugas.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me know if someone could just, Dr. Janowski, do you see that okay?
Yes,
good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. And thank you so much. This actually, as I was listening to Dr. Branca, it's a really nice follow-on from the children and infants and stunting to the data that I have from our international study that we've been doing actually since our cohort studies have been going since 2008. So I just make sure this moves. All right, I have no disclosures, and the work that I'm going to be telling you about today was funded by NIDDK as well as HLBI, and that is through funding from Dr. Amy Luke, Dr. Ramon DeRosa, and I hold 2 RL1s. So I can't really start this talk without telling you about the modeling the epidemiologic transition study. And this is Dr. Amy Luke. She really started this work early in the early 2000s, actually. And she and my previous chair, Dr. Richard Cooper, were really instrumental in trying to understand the role of physical activity in the obesity epidemic. And we, in the early 2000s or in 10, started publishing data where we actually looked at measured physical activity as well as energy expenditure and how it is related to future risk of adiposity and cardiometabolic risks. And so Amy raised funds, she got funded by NIDDK in 2008 to actually explore the relationship between physical activity and adiposity and future cardiovascular risk in 5 African origin populations. And that was through the modeling the epidemiologic transition study. So our study was at the coordinating center was at Loyola, and we selected 5 research sites. So and the 5 research sites were actually spanning the epidemiologic transition from Ghana, which is considered by the UN assigned Human Development Index as a low middle income country. South Africa is considered a middle. Jamaica is considered a high. Seychelles is considered a very high. And then, of course, the US is considered very high according to the UN assigned Human Development Index. And so we partnered with universities across the globe, as well as the Ministry of Health in Seychelles as our research partners. And at each of these sites, we went out to recruit young adults. Our goal was really to capture people before they developed a disease. So our an age range initially was 25 to 45, and everyone in our study was either African origin or African American in the US. So this is actually pilot data that we collected, and it's ranked, and most of my figures are like this. It's always ranked from the lowest in Ghana all the way up to the US. So we use the Human Development Index as our ranking. And as you can see, as you move up the human development status or across the epidemiologic transition, the prevalence of obesity, which is the blue squares, increases from being the lowest in Ghana to the highest in the US. And actually our baseline data, so this is now the countries go down, Ghana at the top to the United States at the bottom, and you can see the prevalence of really obesity was very low in 2010 in Ghana, all the way up to 52% in our US cohort. And just to orientate you, the African-American population that we've been following live on the western side of Chicago in a town called Maywood. And Maywood is one of the oldest established towns on the western side of Chicago. The prevalence of diabetes was very low in Ghana, South Africa, and Jamaica. And then as you moved up the transition, as we expect, the prevalence in our Maywoodians was already 10% in 2010, as was the hypertension was very low in Ghana, all the way up to already 27% of our participants in Maywood had hypertension. You may notice that the hypertension stands out in South Africa. And in fact, we have published a paper looking at why, what could be behind the very high prevalence of hypertension in South Africa, given, especially among the men, their mean BMI is 22. The women actually have a very, it's actually, obesity is quite prevalent, so it was more expected. But what we actually found was that in our 2 biracial societies, so South Africa and the US, the blood pressures were exceptionally much higher than what we would expect compared to those societies that were not biracial. But I'm talking to you today about sleep and the gut microbiota. And this is actually data that we published in 2020. And this comes from our baseline questionnaire that was self-reported, and participants were asked just straight out, approximately how many hours do you sleep each night? And what immediately will jump out is that among the South Africans, they are reporting on a mean sleep duration among both the men and the women of about 11 hours. And then on the other end, we have the American population who are averaging about 6 hours of sleep a night. And in South Africa, when you look at the guidelines, so the sleep guidelines recommend that adults accumulate between 7 and 9 hours of sleep a night. In South Africa, we see that less than 3% of the cohort reported that they were getting less than 7 hours, and over 74% were sleeping more than 9 hours. That was among the men, and completely different to the US cohort, where 45% of the men slept less than 7 hours and only 4% slept longer than 9 hours. Among the women, it was exactly the same, where less than 2% were sleeping less than 7 hours in South Africa. Amazing 73% were sleeping more than 9 hours. And among the US women, 43% said they slept less than 7 hours, and only 0.5% said they slept more than 9 hours. So this was just incredible data to us, and actually was really the impetus for our grant that we got funded, looking at sleep and sleep timing and the gut microbiota in our international cohort. So, but how in our cohort did sleep and obesity risk relate or associate? So this is among the men. And so when we actually just broke it down by hours of sleep, so from less than 6 hours a night to more than 10 hours, you see among the men that the longer you slept, then the less adiposity you had. And in fact, the greatest adiposity was seen in men who got less than 6 hours. The women followed a much more typical U-shaped curve, where both women on the low end and the high, the long sleep, so both short sleep and long sleep, had more obesity compared to the women who appeared to be getting the optimal hours of sleep. But this was all self-report, and we really wanted to, get a handle on what was actually happening. So we did get a study funded in 2019 by NHLBI that allowed us to actually put monitors on our large cohort of 2,000 people. Just at the same time, we also did at baseline, we did 2 24-hour recalls in our participants. And so our participants at all the sites at baseline came into the research clinic, and we did all of the questionnaires, the anthropometrics, and they would leave wearing a physical activity monitor, and then they would come back a week later. And so we had the opportunity to actually get 2 24-hour recalls in these participants. And at baseline, we actually had 2,500 people in our study. So that was 5,000 24-hour recalls that we were able to analyze. And when you look at the top self-reported foods in MET, so in Ghana, it's not surprising that the top foods were light soups, tomato stew, banku, which is ground up cassava that's then boiled, and fufu, groundnut soup, yams, were all among the top foods. In South Africa, the South Africans have really switched to bread. There's still a lot of chicken, rice. Samp is this, it's a maize meal mixed with other beans and potatoes. In Jamaica, the top reported food was chicken, then followed by rice dumplings. This is like a fried bread that then is filled with chicken, or it's plain. Rice and peas, plantains. In Seychelles, the top reported food item was rice, followed by chicken soup, pork, onions, and carrots. And actually, when we first looked at the top reported foods, what we found is that the top reported food item in the US was actually soda. But we really wanted to focus on, because I was interested in the gut microbiome work, the actual eaten foods. And then, so when we looked at it that way, we took out soda. The top reported food item in this cohort was actually candy, followed by chicken, white bread, French fries, and then cookies. And that really got me thinking already back in 2010, 2011, I just done a metabolomic study. And we know that for your metabolomic profile, so much of it is determined by your diet. And so when we really started diving into the diet, and we published this in 2018, we looked at the association between dietary fiber and cardiometabolic risk in our METS participants. And so it's not, again, surprising that the biggest portion, or the largest people who eat fiber are from Ghana, all the way down to our highest income countries, being Seychelles and the US. And you can see that the Ghanaians eat almost twice the amount of insoluble fiber compared to the participants in both the Seychelles and the US. And when it comes to fat in the diet, we found that our participants in the US were eating almost 1.5 times the amount of fat compared to people in Ghana. Now, when you separate those we were able to then look at quartiles of fiber intake, and one being the lowest quartile of fiber intake. You can see that when it comes to metabolic syndrome, using the 5 criteria by the ATP, or inflammation measured by CRP, or adiposity or obesity by BMI, you can see that the higher or the more fiber you are eating, the more you are protected from inflammation, from having inflammation or adiposity. And these models were all adjusted for age, gender, site, energy intake, as well as physical activity and smoking. So I was really interested. My background is in physiology, and I'm looking at all of this data, and I'm thinking, goodness me, I'd done the metabolomics, and I could see the profiles were linked to adiposity as well. And it really then struck me, where's the source for these metabolites? And luckily, my collaborator at UIC, University of Illinois in Chicago, Dr. Brian Layden, who is an endocrinologist, was very interested in short-chain fatty acid receptors. And so we started collaborating. And the first thing we did was try and see, well, where are the other international studies of the gut microbiota? And this is work we initiated in 2014. And at the time, there were really only 5 other international studies that were looking at populations as they spanned the epidemiologic transition, or just geographic regions, and were comparing the microbiota. And we then, after seeing this, thought, well, this was an amazing opportunity for us to really get going and understand in a longitudinal cohort that we'd already had 5 years of data, what the role of the microbiome was in the development of cardiometabolic disease. So we started, we were fortunate, we were funded in 2017 by NIDDK to look at the gut microbiota across the epidemiologic transition and the role of fecal short-chain fatty acids. And it was no surprise to us that, this is our data from our baseline, that the diversity of the gut microbiota is highest in the Ghanaians and lowest in our participants from South Africa. And excuse me, the South Africans and the Ghanaians, you can see, have the highest diversity in their gut microbiota. So not only are they diverse, but the species that are there are very rich. The lowest diversity is in the Seychelles and the US participants. And we know that a lot of this has been driven by the high fiber intake in the Ghanaian participants. And if you look at the fiber intake, and this is obviously data though from 2010, and this is data from 2019, it's no surprise when you look at the fiber intake among the different sites. So this is Ghana, and here's Ghana, Jamaica, Seychelles, and the US. We had to unfortunately exclude the South Africa data from the fiber intake. Microbial communities are significantly different between sites, as we would expect. And so you can see the South Africans are clustering over here, the Jamaicans over here, the US participants over here, and the Ghanaians seem to be more clustered over here. And so we are able to predict countries by the composition of the gut microbiota. And what is really, and this is really the crux of our work that we've been doing, is that microbial communities and the actual proportion of the community membership really shift with cardiometabolic disease. So this is obviously a pooled analysis, and the green are the normal BMI, and the obese participants are in orange. And what we show, and this is really exciting, is that the international trends in the community composition hold up despite the differences, the big differences in the gut microbiome. And this is really one of the big things that we were trying to understand, is how does the gut microbiota change with disease risk, or adiposity, or cardiometabolic disease, in spite of these differences in the communities based on where you live and the differences in your diet. And this is work we published from our pilot work in 2019, that when you look at people who are characterized by metabolic syndrome, using the 5 metabolic syndrome criteria, you can see that the diversity of the gut microbiota is actually lower in those that are classified as having metabolic syndrome. And this is after adjusting for site and age and sex differences. And of course, we're able to really unpack which are the species that are different, and looking at the relative abundance. And it's exciting for us to see that the species data really hold up, where these Lactobacillus bacteroids, they are really responsible for synthesizing LPS, which we know is linked to an elevated cardiometabolic risk, as well as then these Clostridiales prevotella. These are all butyrate producers, and those are very important for reducing the risk of cardiometabolic disease. But getting back to the sleep, we also are able, this is also very exciting, we were able, using our pilot data, actually to look at people's sleep length, and then the diversity of their gut microbiota. And so the short sleepers are the red, the normal sleepers are the green, and the long sleepers are in blue. And you can certainly see that these people that are getting too little sleep, or short sleep of that less than 7 hours, they have differences in the composition of their gut microbiota, with species differences that are linked to cardiometabolic disease, whereas these Prevotella, again, Ruminococcocia, and also Spirea, which are known short-chain fatty acid producers and linked to good health, seem to be more prevalent among the long sleepers. So as I said, we saw that in METs, we had the self-report data that the South Africans were sleeping on average 11 hours, and our US participants were sleeping, about 6 hours a night. And we got funding from NHLBI then to actually go back into 1,000 of our METs original microbiome participants. So we selected 200 people from each of the sites, and we've now been following them. They're about to start actually their 3rd year of follow-up, and so this is data that we've just putting together. So all of our participants have been wearing a Acti watch for 7 days with their physical activity monitor. And this is actually just data from one of our South African participants. You can see this is a nice habitual sleeper. They're going to bed pretty much the same time every night, waking up the same time every day, with not too much movement during the night. This is actually a very poor sleeper. You can see how there's very little routine in their bedtime, as is in their wake time. You can see from day to day, their sleep time is very different, and not repeatable. In fact, this is not what you'd like to see in when you put a monitor on someone. So this is actual data, and from our the MET sleep study. The initial data from the South African sample, the Seychelles sample, and the US sample. These are the groups we've analyzed to date. So this is, first of all, just looking at time in bed. And it was really a relief to see this, that from the monitor data, you can see that the South Africans are really, it's true, they spend a lot of time in bed, whereas the people in Seychelles and the US, you'll see they're spending approximately just under 7.5 hours in bed. This is actually now looking at the total sleep time. So this is time in bed, but this is the actual sleep time. And you'll see that from the monitors. So the South Africans are getting into bed, but they are sleeping 7 hours, right? Whereas the cohort from Seychelles and the US, you see they're in bed for about 7.5 hours, and they're actually getting about 6.5 hours of sleep. Now, this allows us actually to calculate sleep efficiency, and you'll see, or if you can imagine, it is very poor sleep efficiency in the South African cohort. They're in bed for over almost 10 hours, but they're only sleeping 7 hours compared to the participants from the US and Seychelles. And this is just to show you, this was our, on the bottom, this is the self-report sleep data from our baseline with the against actually the measured objective data from the monitors. And you can see that our questionnaires are actually holding up actually pretty well against what people were reporting. So what are we seeing across our sites? We see that there are shifts as to when people are going to bed. And so this is time on the bottom x-axis. So this is 7 o'clock over here. So our South African cohort is getting into bed very early, peaking around 9:30. And that is different to the people in the Seychelles, where you see the peaking is around 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. And our US participants, you can see they're going to bed it peaks around 11:30 at night. The wake up time is also shifted. The folks that are getting up the earliest are those that live in the Seychelles, followed by the wake up time with the bedtime. So that's the shortest in the Seychelles, and then you see the US, and you can see that tail out for our South African participants. The midpoint sleep. So this is how we are able to classify our early birds versus our late nights or the owls. And you can see that the South Africans and the Seychelles cohort are definitely the early birds compared to the US participants, where their midpoint in sleep comes about 3.5 hours after they have gone to sleep. And this is just to really, this is very busy, but I wanted to highlight the efficiency. So among the, say, South African cohort, you have a very low sleep efficiency. Normally, you'd want to see that the efficiency is around about 90%. So it's still low among our Seychelles and US participants. But it is very low among the South Africans. And what happens is that the frequency of naps is very high among our South Africans. And this is probably to make up for their very poor sleep efficiency, whereas our cohort in the Seychelles and the US, they really are not napping a lot. Now, I just wanted to show you just how this links out to cardiometabolic risk. And so this again is busy, but this is a side-by-side comparison of our same cohort. So this is the data from 2010, where adiposity, as you remember, was very low in Ghana, peaking in the US. And in just the space of 10 years, we now see that the adiposity prevalence, or obesity prevalence, has doubled in Ghana up to 22%. In South Africa, it's almost 50% of our sample are obese. The same with Jamaica. they went from only 28% prevalence of obesity to 42%. Same in Seychelles, 26% to 41%. And surprisingly, we were surprised in the US as well that there's still increasing prevalence of obesity, where they went from 52% to 64%. Now, of course, the caveat being that the cohort is 10 years older, but still we were surprised. Most shockingly was the marked increase in the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. And this at the moment is self-report use of insulins, as well as a fasted blood draw. So what we see in Ghana is that the prevalence of diabetes went from 1% all the way up to 12%. South Africans went to 5%, but in Seychelles, where they experienced one of the greatest increases in the prevalence of obesity, you remember they went from 26% all the way up to 41%. We're now seeing almost 20% of the sample has diabetes by definition. And of course, the US saw a market increase that went with the increase in obesity. So that I'm gonna just stop and take some questions. This is we had our investor, we try and do an investigator meeting every couple of years, and because of COVID, we were not able to do that. So this was we were all very excited. This is in June when we all got together in Ghana to discuss our data, plan our manuscripts. And of course, I'd like to thank my collaborators, especially at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana, the University of Cape Town, and the Medical Research Council in South Africa, Terence Forresters at the University of West Indies in Jamaica, Dr. Pascal Beauvais is at the Ministry of Health in Seychelles, and then of course, Brian Layden at the University of Illinois in Chicago, as well as my microbiome team, which is at the University of California, San Diego. And I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk, and we have several questions from the audience. I think we'll have time for a couple. I'm going to read one of them that was just sent directly to me, which is this person is interested in the factors that account for substantial differences in sleep patterns in South Africa, including, being in bed more and lower sleep efficiency.
So actually, I attended a talk just a couple of days ago because one of the questionnaires that we get with the sleep study is we ask people about fear and fear in the neighborhoods and how safe you feel. And actually, I should have expanded on this. So our cohort is in Ghana, lives in a rural village of about 5,000 people. It's very safe. Our cohort in South Africa live in one of the third largest townships in South Africa is Khayelitsha. There is high crime, and there is a lot of social stress as well. And we're now really trying to unpack it, but it seems like people, they live in a one-room aluminum structure that is, at best flimsy, and people, when they report on their fear of going outside at night, people seem to be, if you can imagine a family of 6 in a single room structure, and you're not comfortable going outside, or you're fearful to be outside because you don't think it's safe, then one of the things that you might be doing then is just going to bed early, or being in your bed because you can't go outside. So we're really unpacking this fear of being in an unsafe neighborhood.
Thank you. I think we'll do one more question, and then you can see them, I believe, Dr. Dugas, in the chat, so you can answer the others.
Okay, I will definitely.
So this was from Dr. Sasi for Dr. Dugas. You seem to have identified clear associations in your gut microbiota study, but how confident are you that the pathway from fiber intake to gut microbiome diversity to cardiometabolic risk reflects causal links?
Okay, as an epidemiologist, I'm not very confident. So I will say though that we're unpacking everything, the covariates especially. It's not just the diet, and we have a lot of factors that we know exactly how many people live in a house. Down to people sharing beds, whether they have animals in the house, what is the exposure to livestock. We have all of these covariates that we're actually unpacking at the moment, because it's not only your diet, right? Infectious, and I saw actually someone was asking about the high infectious disease burden, and actually that's one of my new grants. We're looking at the intersection of the gut microbiota and these non-communicable diseases in populations with high disease burdens, where there are medications or antiretroviral drugs that are impacting on the gut microbiome. So if you are, have this high disease burden or infectious disease burden, and you're on antiretrovirals that are obesogenic anyway, and maybe altering the composition of your gut microbiome. So it would be very short-sighted to say it is only diet, but certainly diet and the fiber intake is instrumental in driving the composition of the gut microbiome.
I think I'm going to ask one more question, because it fits in, I think, with your response. Dr. Maravata wants to know, in African populations, did you collect the frequency of infectious disease burden or antibiotic use?
Yes, so we do collect it, but unfortunately, when we do their in-person visit, we capture the health of that person over the last year, and so we obviously we try and capture as much as we can, but it's self-report, right? And so we have these yearly, it's probably works out to bi-yearly in-person exams. So every 2 years, our participants are in our research clinic. And so we're trying to capture pregnancies and babies. We're trying to capture diseases. And so we do have all of that information. But you're absolutely right that antibiotic use, we won't be able to capture as accurately as we can. We do stipulate that if they have been on antibiotics in the preceding 3 months, that they need to come back then for their research visit after a 3-month period because of the microbiome.
Great, thank you. Thank you again for a wonderful talk. We're going to be on a break now until our next talk at 11 o'clock. And I do want to let people know, a couple of people have mentioned, you can't put your question in the chat and have it go to everyone, unfortunately, but you can write your question in and send it as a direct message to Mark, Dennis, or myself. And we'll make sure that the questions get presented to our speakers. So thanks everybody, and thanks to our initial speakers, and we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Hello, it's 11 o'clock, and so we'll get started with our next session. I do want to point out that I heard from a couple of people that they weren't allowed to put in their questions or comments to everyone, that they had to send it as a direct message to an individual, but that's been fixed. So everyone can now just use everyone to send their questions. And I'm now delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Marcela Nunes-Smith. Dr. Nunes-Smith is Associate Dean for Health Equity Research and the CNH Long Professor of Medicine, Public Health and Management, and Director of the Equity Research and Innovation Center at Yale University. Her research focuses on health and healthcare equity for marginalized populations, with an emphasis on the social and structural determinants of health, the influence of healthcare systems on health disparities, and the advancement of community academic partnered scholarship. Dr. Nunes-Smith served as Senior Advisor to the White House COVID-19 response team and Chair of the Presidential COVID-19 Health Equity Task Force, co-chair of the Biden-Harris Transition COVID-19 Advisory Board, and chair of the Governor's Reopen CT Connecticut Advisory Group Community Committee. As an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, she attended Jefferson Medical College, residency at Harvard's Brigham and Women's Hospital, and did a fellowship at the Yale Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Clinical Scholars Program. Dr. Nunez-Smith's talk is entitled Obesity and Cardiometabolic Disease in Eastern Caribbean Populations. Dr. Nunez-Smith.
Thank you so much, and good day to everyone. I'm really looking forward to our time together today. I do have a slide deck I will pull up, and we'll be mindful of the time, so we do have time for questions. I'm really excited on behalf of our entire network from the Eastern Caribbean Health Outcomes Research Network side to be presenting on behalf of that team. So I have no disclosures before sharing this information with you. So for our time, the talk is sort of in 3 chapters, as it were. I wanted to spend a few minutes giving an overview of the Eastern Caribbean Health Outcomes Research Network that we have referred to as ECORN, and then to look at some of the emerging research that we're doing that I think is related to today's topic, before closing with a little bit of future watch and policy context. So the Eastern Caribbean, I think hopefully many of you have had a chance to visit this region. It is lovely, one of the most lovely places in the world. I grew up in the US Virgin Islands, which is a very, very small dot on this map. But you can see it's an archipelago of islands, widely known for its natural beauty. As someone growing up in the Virgin Islands and then going on to become a healthcare professional, I've always been really interested in this region from a health standpoint, and in particular in the health of the residents of the US territories that are in this region, which include the US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Maybe what not everybody realizes is just how great the burden is in this region for NCDs, and that has become a substantial professional interest and personal interest of mine. I shared the slide from back in 2011 for some context. This is, people recognize this as the United Nations. This is the General Assembly high-level meeting. This was only the second time such a meeting had occurred. There have actually been subsequent ones now on this topic of NCDs. People among the participants in today's meeting will likely know that first UN General Assembly high-level meeting that focused on a health topic was back in September 2001 and focused on HIV and AIDS. Now, if you're familiar with this meeting, not everyone knows that this really was spurred from CARICOM, which is the Caribbean community, a group of Caribbean nations coming together under that umbrella, CARICOM, but petitioning for this meeting in recognition of all the great burden of chronic disease, leading obesity in the region. And I've pictured here 2 just luminaries who were behind this work and this call, Sir Trevor Hassel, who works very closely with us at ECHO, and Sir George Aline. So just an overview of the network. So we're really excited about this consortium that we've built. I mean, coming out of that UN meeting, one of the things that was made just abundantly clear was the recognition was shared, particularly around small nations and small island states, that this was urgent, that we were at crisis level when it came to chronic disease, but there really just wasn't great infrastructure around the data collection that was going to be needed to drive and inform policy, behavioral change, and clinical practice. And so ECORN sort of emerged in that shadow. We're really grateful to NIH for the initial funding and sustained funding since the inception of this network through EU mechanisms from NIMHD and an R01 from NHLBI that has allowed us to really grow over time, beginning with this question of healthcare and health in the US territories, in the region particularly, bringing in other partner sites, beyond US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico to include Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados for cultural context and comparisons. Starting with at the core, building a cohort study of adults that we have now expanded to children with that support from NHLBI for a really one of its kind in region intergenerational cohort focused on NCDs. And so that is the Equine Cohort Study, or ECS. And so at the center of our work is the ECS and other ancillary studies. But around this and to support this and to guide our work, we have sites, a coordinating center here at Yale, sites, of course, in all of the partner islands, and an expansive network of partners, policy, community, from many different sectors to help guide it. And over the past few years, really proud of the work that the network has been able to achieve across domains in terms of expanding the number of investigators connected with the work, expanding the number of stakeholders connected with the work, going much deeper on, of course, providing data that policymakers have said is critical for their decision-making, but really having a focus on harmonization and data sharing. The work that we do, we want to be very responsive and accountable to community, and a big part of that has been the policy partnerships there. And perhaps in terms of our science, one of the more recent activities and initiatives has been expanding beyond our observational work in the cohort study to implementing evidence-based interventions. The rationale for the network really does lie in this understanding that we just needed better visibility into what was happening in the region. And of course, thinking about the US context and those US territories. Bringing together the partners that are shown here represents incredible diversity within the region, ranging from ancestry to self-identified ethnic designation, to healthcare system variation and diversity, to socioeconomic diversity as well. We've had very high level objectives all along. We want to make sure that we're expanding clinical research with this understudied population, but along the way, being sure that we are in partnership strengthening capacity and infrastructure specific to NCDs, and all in service of policy and practice change. I mentioned briefly the principal investigators earlier in the broader network. Each of my close colleagues, we've been working together now for many years, pictured here leading site teams, each one a health leader, but a community leader as well. Just so much credit and hats off, particularly in this time of COVID and so many challenges between hurricanes and earthquakes and other natural disasters, and the teams have been steadfast in staying connected with our core study participants and continuing our work. Really important, just in this context, setting a part of our conversation, for me to lift up our governing board. From the very beginning, we are centered and aim to be centered on community voice, community expertise, community need as we do the work. And we have a tremendous governing board. Here are our co-chairs, and all the members are pictured. This group has grown over time, and it really functions as our board of directors to make sure that we are conducting the research in a way that is culturally responsive and appropriate, timely and relevant for the research policy and practice needs that are within the region. So a thank you to Dr. Laverne Raxter, who's President Emerita at the University of the Virgin Islands and a climate science scholar. And then the aforementioned Sir Professor Trevor Hassel, who is a cardiologist by professional training and leads Healthy Caribbean Coalition, which is a dominant force in the region to advance health, particularly in NCDs through civil society engagement. Just at 30,000 foot at some of the initiatives across the network. I've talked about the core study, and of course, with the remaining time, we'll go a little bit deeper there. We have several other ancillary studies. Some of them are highlighted here, not all. in our mission to continue to strengthen capacity and build upon assets that are already in region. It's been wonderful to be able to support investigators at universities in the region and pilot projects and other mechanisms. I'll talk some more about Lyme. This is one of the core projects in our implementation science core. And I mentioned data sharing. And we're doing much more work now in thinking about obesity and risk across the life course, and have a focus now on childhood obesity. And I mentioned we're thinking a great deal, of course, about the connections between climate and natural disaster and health in the region. I won't spend much time on this, just recognizing the limited time for today. But just wanted to share some of how we really expanded over the years, and now the consortium is broad reaching, and we have contributions from consortium members and partners even beyond our 4 inaugural sites. So we're now in wave 2 of data collection for the equine cohort study. This is a snapshot. I'm certainly happy to take questions to go deeper. We are following approximately 3,000 community dwelling adults through this work across those 4 sites. There is a fairly intensive, especially at baseline, intake. In terms of our participants, we skew female, and I just wanted to share, and the team did some highlights in terms of the prevalence that we observed of relevant chronic diseases, and might for today look particularly in terms of overweight and obese. This chart on the left, the green to orient, is our baseline data, which again reflects about 3,000 people in terms of the N. The blue is just an interim analysis for wave 2, where we at this point I think have about half of the community dwelling adults who have followed up. And perhaps not surprising, but we have signals in our data that show rising NCD prevalence at people at follow-up, which is around 4.5 years after initial intake. So you know, we did in the initial, of course, think quite a bit about obesity and weight-related conditions and weight-related risks. We're lifting up here sort of one question that came from the governing board, and we were able to answer with our data set, which is, you know, what do we really understand from this life course perspective, what's going on with obesity and in particular CVD risk. Here we did an analysis that showed that looking at adult perceptions within the cohort of child weight, and found some very interesting things, including this association between adult self-perceptions of their own weight really being what drove their perceptions, often different from how the child would be classified in terms of overweight and obese status, but really not driven at all by socioeconomic factors. The strongest was the sort of adult self-perception. And I think we all recognize just the cultural context in which we talk about issues such as weight and obesity, and that is true in the Caribbean as it is in many different regions of the world. But we were really excited, triggered by these questions and some of those kernels there in the adults to propose looking at intergenerational factors for pediatric CVD risk and the relationship with sleep, particularly sleep deficits and pediatric obesity and other conditions. So that work is ongoing with support from NHLBI. Just a few other, I think, study vignettes to share with you today. We do have several investigators who are very interested in these questions of weight perception and weight misperception, and have done several studies looking at that. This is just one, again, asking this question of the association between weight misperception and engagement in terms of weight control behaviors, and finding that the majority of people who were classified using BMI, and I'll sort of come back to that in sort of some measurement questions. But when we look at BMI only, and that's what's reflected on the earlier graph that I showed you, the majority of those who were overweight and obese under-assessed their actual weight, and that's consistent with research we've seen in other parts of the world. And then sort of moreover, those with weight perception were really much less likely to attempt weight loss than those who had their accurate overweight or obese weight perception. So I've sort of gotten in this vignette, I think, you know, a lot of what we have seen in wave one, I think is hypothesis generating, is raising some questions for us for further inquiry and further study. And so the weight perception piece, I think, is very significant, but we are struggling some with thinking around measurement and what is the most accurate measurement for us to capture obesity related risk. And so here are just a couple of papers. The one in the bottom is a new release as we are thinking about maybe looking at some novel measurement approaches to capture anthropometric data that might be useful. What is on the left, and really is a summary of the paper on the top left, was taking our data from wave one and looking at the association of different anthropometric measures of obesity with 10-year cardiovascular risk. For time, I won't go into all of the methods that you can read here, but essentially it raised some questions as to whether or not there might be other approaches instead of BMI, such as waist to hip ratio, that might be better predictors of cardiovascular risk in this population. And I know there is ongoing discussion about thinking about BMI and maybe its place as one of several ways to assess weight status and weight-related risk, such as in cardiovascular disease and others. I want to turn now just to briefly talk about Lyme. We do have a lot of acronyms in our work, and so this is no exception. This is a lifestyle intervention with metformin escalation project. This is an intervention based at clinical sites that are partnering with us. So the participants involved in this work are not in our cohort study. This has been an opportunity to engage clinical sites and clinical providers and their patients in this work, really trying to be responsive to the clear signals in our data in terms of increasing prevalence and incidence of diabetes. And so as the name suggests, in terms of the project, modified and informed by really excellent, elegant work that's come before, but thinking about staged lifestyle modification intervention with escalation to metformin. With the analysis, and so again, this was seen as a sort of proof of concept initial project, and at 12 months, well, first was noted at the intervals, significant reduction in A1C and weight, and continued reduction at that final point of follow-up at 12 months. And that greatest weight reduction was noted at 6 months. We're really digging into some of the qualitative data, which we think will provide just richer, deeper context for what we saw in this work. And not something that I feature here today, but I think something that's interesting in the ways in which we try to have different parts of the network and the science connect is we have funded through our pilot project mechanism an investigator in region to study metformin failure in this population, which many providers in region have reported to us. And so that team is doing some analysis looking at SNPs and seeing if there might be some associations and higher prevalence of metformin failure in the populations in region. So I think really interesting as we think about the recommendations that currently exist around metformin use. Shifting more now towards some of our policy work, really trying to be grounded always in working closely with the folks who are in the communities that are most affected to get solutions. That's where we know the solutions can be found, using different techniques to identify levers that can be pulled in the policy space. And across all of our sites, have great colleagues, this work led by Dr. Sadia Hassan, to do and colleagues to use participatory group model building, really asking this question around childhood obesity and where those levers are to be pulled. And so for those of you who are familiar, this is just one visualization output from that work, but also ongoing, really in concert with policy makers. And so the first product from this is actually a policy brief. Just a few minutes more, I think, before I'll pull the slides down. But again, the work here and so much of our emphasis is conducting research that can inform policy, and that's very bidirectional. And so when there are natural policy experiments that occur in the region, we are certainly eager to provide sort of research and evaluative assistance in those spaces too. This is one example. The Healthy Caribbean Coalition, which is, as I mentioned, led by Sir Professor Trevor Hassel. You might not be able to see it so small under here, but they have really evolved to focus now almost exclusively on childhood obesity prevention as just one of their leading goals. This does bring together across the entire Caribbean, Eastern and Western civil society, so community-based organizations and NGOs and others kind of rowing in the same direction for health of Caribbean people. Looking back in 2017, the HCC was at the forefront of calling for taxation of sugar-sweetened beverages for children and also marketing piece. And we often refer to this policy, which was implemented in many Caribbean island states as the sugar-sweetened beverage SSB ban. In Barbados, which is where HCC is headquartered, this policy was very successful in terms of reducing consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages from children. And so a policy intervention with success. Implementation differed across all of the islands. And so we've been doing work both in terms of positive deviance and understanding how in Barbados this was so successful, and then understanding where there are sort of growth opportunities for next stage implementation in some of the other islands. And that's some of the work we've done in partnership with TNT, Trinidad and Tobago, with some of our student trainees, thinking about how best to consider moving forward with the project to be successful in future rounds of implementation. Again, I think I'm coming to the end of the slide deck, but we are very value driven in the work that we do in ECORN, and so in the spirit of data access and data democracy, we do make our data available. Explore ECORN is our platform for doing that. It's mostly sort of bivariate analyses. This is not the portal for researchers and investigators who might want to work with our data. We do have a data access and scientific review committee and process for investigators, but this really is for everybody else, ECS participants, policymakers, and others who want to know more about the data. So I'll wrap. ECORN, again, we are so incredibly grateful to the ECS participants, to the site teams, to the team at the coordinating center, and of course to all our funders, including multiple ICs at NIH to support this work. This is the first of its kind regional collaboration. We are working across nations. The US flag flies in Puerto Rico and USVI, Barbados and Trinidad are independent nation states. And so really quite unique to do that, but everyone is similarly focused on this mission of addressing the NCD epidemic in the region. I think when we look at our baseline data from the cohort study from ECS, there are questions I think raised. I'm not sure any of us are at a point of saying definitively yet, but we are curious about what are the appropriate weight-related risk measures across groups and in our cohort in particular. We do this work, the how matters a lot, so that intentional partnership with policy partners and community experts to drive the research takes us really in these directions. And our governing board has raised this a lot. really suspicious from our baseline data collection as to whether BMI was the right metric for us to use if we wanted to think about risk and risk calculation. So we're sitting with that question. Everybody here knows this. In weight-related research, we cannot underestimate that importance of cultural context and nuance and meaning in connection to food. I don't think I highlighted it earlier, but obviously there are a lot of unique food, diet, nutritional issues there. We have a substantial burden of food insecurity within our cohort as well. And we do try to leverage multiple research designs and settings to advance the work. And as we look sort of to our next chapter, continuing to leverage this research infrastructure that's established and growing to advance capacity building, data sharing, and policy change. So just some acknowledgements to the PIs and to the teams and the governing board and our participants, of course, and our scientific advisors and other investigators and awardees. I'm really appreciative for everybody's lift to keep this work going. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Nunes-Smith, for that very interesting presentation. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. Dr. Donzi, are you around? Do you want to ask your question? I don't know if she can or not.
I can also see the questions if that's easier. I can read them.
Sure.
So thank you for the questions that are in the chat to everyone. That first question from Dr. Donzi was around Lyme, in particular, the lifestyle intervention with metformin escalation project, to say more about weight loss being greater at 6 months versus 12 months, and then participants stay on metformin for 12 months, and some weight rebound at 12 months. So thank you. You honed right in on, I think, what is just really fascinating about the data set. So folks were on metformin for less than 12 months for the project period, because there was sort of a run-in time for the behavioral intervention only that varied some, but sort of was around 12 weeks. But absolutely, once put on metformin, folks were stayed on metformin and were able to escalate in dose after that 6-month check-in. I think it was somewhat aligned with what the governing board expected to see in terms of some weight rebound at that 12 months. But I think we were actually optimistic, because going into it, we thought that we might see people return to baseline at the 12 months. So seeing sustained weight loss there, I think, was really encouraging to us. But I think there is a lot around community that we've started to see in the qualitative data that the participants talked about. And so they were forming community with their peers, and it almost became like a peer support intervention along the way. And so now thinking about ways to enhance using, for example, they're building an app. They want to build an app to stay connected and inspire each other in the work, and continue to organize things like group walks and behavior. So more to come there, but really interesting. Thanks for that question.
And thank you. And Dr. Sasi, do you want to mention your comment as well?
Thank you. That was really a comment, actually, not a question. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I've worked in the area, and I know how committed people from the Caribbean are to the fight against non-communicable diseases.
Yes, thank you so much for your comment and your observation. Completely agree that a lot of the differences we see are policy implementation differences, and how the tax structure was designed, particularly around that sugar sweetened beverage tax.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you again so much. And we can move on. We're right on time with our next presentation, which is Dr. Franco Sasi. Professor Sasi graduated with a degree in economics and a doctorate in health economics from the University of London in 2000. He's currently chair in international health policy and economics and director of the Center for Health Economics and Policy Innovation at Imperial College Business School, and a senior health economist at the OECD. Professor Sasi's research focuses on economic analysis of health services, the economics of chronic disease prevention, and measuring inequalities in access to healthcare. He's principal investigator and project coordinator of the European Commission-funded Horizon 2020 project, Science and Technology in Childhood Obesity Policy, or STOP. He's the editor of Health Taxes, Policy and Practice, and the author of a large number of publications on the economics of chronic disease prevention. He was awarded a 2000-2001 Commonwealth Fund Harkness Fellowship in Healthcare Policy, and his talk today is entitled Stop, Addressing the Challenge of Childhood Obesity in Europe. Dr. Sassi?
Thank you, Susan. That was a very nice introduction. I'll share my presentation. In the meantime, I'll just say that the picture you see in the background on my screen is actually a picture of Imperial College's campus. And what you see in the middle there is called the Queen's Tower, which dates back to the Victorian era. Actually, that was Queen Victoria who established the Imperial Institute, which is the predecessor to the current Imperial College in London. So after that bit of history, let me just start my presentation. The presentation, as you correctly said, Susan, is about the STOP project, which is a project funded by the European Commission that has been going on since 2018. So we are in the fourth year of the project, and the project will actually end at the end of November 2022, so in just a few months. What I'm trying to show you in this presentation is just a snapshot, an overview, very brief overview of some of the key results of the project. And of course, I'm happy to expand on any aspects of it in the question time if we do have an opportunity. So this is the consortium. I mean, it's a very large consortium. We have about 30 organizations from 16 different European countries. And the reason why I'm keen to show this slide is that I would like to emphasize that it's not just a research consortium. I mean, what you see in the top left corner of this slide is the research organizations, the universities and the research institutes that are participating in STOP. But there are other types of organizations that are involved that are really enriching the type of research that we are doing in this project. So we have national public health agencies from 6 European countries. We have international organizations, particularly the WHO and the OECD, as well as the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Dr. Francesco Branca, who gave a presentation earlier in this meeting, is actually leading one of the work packages in STOP on behalf of the WHO. And then we have civil society organizations, and we have international partners and business-related organizations. So it's a very diverse and very rich consortium that, as I say, is enabling us to do research in a way that is not perhaps entirely traditional. So this is the structure of the project. As I said, the project is funded for 4.5 years, from 2018 to 2022. And the main components of the STOP project are all geared towards improving policy for childhood obesity. The STOP project is one of 2 projects that have been funded by the European Commission with an investment of 20 million euros, precisely to develop and promote new approaches for addressing childhood obesity, which is, as you can imagine, a major problem in European countries as well as in the US and in many other parts of the world. So what you see at the center of this diagram is the policy development and analysis component of the project, which includes 7 work packages, essentially, 5 of which address specific areas of policy. You can see work package 4 addresses regulation and fiscal policies. Work package 5 addresses consumer behavior policies, particularly policies aimed at creating demand for healthy lifestyles. Work package 6 addresses healthy food and food choice environments. Work package 7 addresses physical activity, particularly at the school level. And work package 8 addresses interventions for preventing or treating obesity at the primary care level in particular. The work package led by WHO is work package 9 that aims at translating the knowledge that has been produced in the 5 policy work packages into actionable policies for governments to be able to implement them effectively. But there are also the two additional work packages that I want to emphasize that are outside of the policy development analysis area, but they're instrumental to developing policy. One is work package 2, which is focusing on measuring childhood obesity. And we're doing this in collaboration with the NIDDK collaboration, which I'm sure most of you would know. That is a global network that is coordinated by the School of Public Health at Imperial College London, aimed at collecting information on obesity and risk factors for non-communicable diseases. And then we have work package 3, which is a work package focusing on the determinants of childhood obesity, in which we have been trying to use biomarkers, particularly epigenetics and various omics biomarkers, to establish causal pathways from different types of exposures to childhood obesity. And this again has been instrumental to developing new approaches for addressing childhood obesity. The expected outputs of the STOP project are summarized in this slide. Essentially, as I say, sorry about that. Essentially, the idea is that we produce outputs, as I mentioned earlier, that are conducive to an improved policy or set of policies to address childhood obesity in Europe and of course elsewhere internationally. So the first output is a comprehensive set of indicators and measurement framework, which should be supporting epidemiological surveillance, which is particularly difficult in children, and especially so in very young children under the age of 5, for which there is very, very little in terms of epidemiological surveillance worldwide. The second set of outputs has to do with the determinants of childhood obesity and the impacts of policies to tackle childhood obesity. And these are areas in which we have aimed to produce new evidence in the STOP project, which I will illustrate briefly during the rest of the presentation. The third set of outputs is really a set of policy translation tools that WHO is leading on, that essentially consist of a number of policy briefs and toolkits for which WHO and some of our partners, civil society partners in particular, are trying to translate the knowledge that is available, and part of which we have produced in the context of the STOP project for policymakers to be able to use and design effective policy actions. And finally, but not least, we are working on developing a multi-stakeholder framework that is effective. Europe or European countries, but also the European Union has been trying in multiple ways to involve stakeholders in the policy process with limited success so far. And we've been trying to work on developing a new multi-stakeholder framework that would overcome some of the challenges that we've been facing so far in getting stakeholders together to work on development of childhood obesity policies. Let me start by summarizing some, start the summary of our findings by summarizing some of the findings in the epidemiology work package 2, as if you remember that diagram that I showed before. Essentially, there are a few areas in which we've been, producing evidence that is, I think, especially relevant in Europe, but also beyond Europe. First of all, on the role of height. So there's a paper that we published in The Lancet in 2020 that was led, as I mentioned, by the NIDDK collaboration, in which we have demonstrated that height has played differences between countries in height growth, have been playing a major role in the obesity epidemic, in the childhood obesity epidemic. And as far as Europe is concerned, in particular, European countries have built up a major advantage in height growth in the first 5 years of life, but then that advantage has been lost over time in recent years, and this has contributed to higher BMI levels in children, particularly older children and adolescents in many European countries. We have also been looking at differences in urban and rural settings in obesity growth, and the NCD-RACE collaboration had produced evidence that was published in Nature a few years ago that in adults, the obesity had grown, especially in rural settings, even more than in urban settings. This is not true for children. And the conclusion that has been drawn as part of the STOP project on children is essentially that socioeconomic status has been the key driver of low socioeconomic status in particular has been the key driver of obesity in children. And we have done a lot of work on trying to understand what dimensions of socioeconomic status are especially important in explaining the growth of obesity in European countries in particular. We've been fortunate to have a data set, an incredibly rich data set at the population level in Finland in particular that we've used to explore this dimension using machine learning approaches. And we've reached the conclusion that household disposable income is the dimension of socioeconomic status that is most strongly associated with socioeconomic disparities in obesity, in childhood obesity, much more so than dimensions like parents' education or the aspects of the environment, of the neighborhood environment in which children grow up. So these are, I think, important findings that have been published in various ways, and some of them are in the process of being published. In terms of determinants of childhood obesity, this is also important work that we've been doing, as I mentioned earlier, leveraging biomarkers, essentially using biomarkers in a mediation analysis framework so that we can try to establish causality as far as we can between a certain number of exposures and childhood obesity. And what you can see in the diagram at the top of this slide is that we've been looking at a very wide range of exposures, starting well before birth. In fact, we've been looking at preconception exposures, even exposures during pregnancy, as well as exposures that occur in early childhood and adolescence. I think one of the key outputs of the STOP project has been to identify what we call the molecular signature of childhood obesity through a range of biomarkers, particularly epigenetics, metabolomics, and proteomics biomarkers. And there have been a few papers that we've been able to publish identifying the extent to which this molecular signature is associated with childhood obesity. Most of this work is actually based on cord blood samples, biomarkers measured in cord blood. So that has allowed us to investigate particularly the role of prenatal exposures, including preconception exposures. So among the pathways that we have identified, the causal pathways that we think are policy relevant, pathways that involve prenatal exposures, as I said, pathways that involve diets that are rich in ultra-processed foods, and also obesogenic environments in neighborhoods, various aspects of neighborhoods, obesogenic environments, which tend to be associated, as you can imagine, with high levels of deprivation and low socioeconomic status. Just to give you one example of the conception exposures that we've been looking at, maternal pre-pregnancy BMI, we have found to be strongly associated with the child's BMI, and also with microcirculation changes, which we have identified by looking at retinal microcirculation networks. And this has provided evidence of an increased cardiovascular risk from the very early years of life. And this is work that we published in JAMA Network Open about 3 years ago, I think. As part of this project, we have also carried out a very large number of systematic reviews, virtually all of which have been published in the journal Obesity Reviews. A series of reviews has been published this year in a dedicated supplement on the determinants of childhood obesity, of which I was one of the co-editors, and we have been looking at a very wide range of determinants in this supplement, all of which we've been able to do, as I say, systematic reviews. Previous work with systematic reviews was focusing on the effectiveness of policies to tackle childhood obesity. And again, we have a series of systematic reviews that were published in 2021, early in 2021. These are in the regular issues of the journal. And I want to just give you, a quick overview of some of the findings of that series of systematic reviews that have been focusing on policies to address childhood obesity. So first of all, we have done systematic reviews of regulatory and fiscal policies. I say we have done, but in fact, I mean, this is an area that has been covered by the WHO, because the WHO, in parallel to the STOP project, had put in place a guideline development process, which for the first time focused on policies to address obesity, that wasn't childhood obesity in particular, to address obesity in general. And the WHO has focused as, the first, guideline development initiatives on fiscal policies, particularly taxes and subsidies, on labeling policies and on marketing regulation policies. So the STOP project, through its investigators, has provided support to the WHO in the development of these guidelines. And many of these systematic reviews that have been produced as part of that process are now published. For instance, the systematic reviews on the effectiveness of taxes and subsidies have been published last year in JAMA Network Open. There are 2 systematic reviews published on that. And what the STOP investigators have focused on is the implementation challenges that are associated with the use of these fiscal and regulatory policies. So there is an additional set of systematic reviews that we have published that are, as I say, focusing on the implementation challenges of these policies. Other systematic reviews that we have done have focused on nudges, for instance, the use of behavioral insights in developing behavior change policies, which have been found to be effective in about 3/4 of the studies that have evaluated these types of interventions. The question here remains one about the sustainability of the effectiveness of these interventions, because all of the studies tend to focus on a fairly short-term perspective, and we don't really know whether the behavior change that is achieved through these nudges can really be sustained over time. That is a gap in knowledge that we really need to fill. A further area is reformulation initiatives, and the evidence here tends to focus mostly on reductions in levels of trans fatty acids in foods or reductions in salt levels in foods. We know, unfortunately, relatively little about the effectiveness of sugar reduction strategies, which would be particularly important in the case of the prevention of childhood obesity. But we have studied the experience, for instance, of countries like the United Kingdom, where there is a sugar reduction program in place. There has been a sugar reduction program in place for a few years that has produced some very interesting results. Then we've been looking at interventions at the school level, both on the food environment and on physical activity. Again, showing that there is a substantial amount of evidence. We've done a meta-analysis as well in the case of physical activity interventions. There's a substantial amount of evidence that these interventions are effective, particularly when you change the food environment. The interventions that involve banning of sugar-sweetened beverages in school environments, or the free provision of fruits and vegetables, they are especially effective in improving children's diets. I'll move forward just to give you a quick overview of the new evidence that we have produced. We haven't just done systematic reviews of existing evidence. We have also produced new studies, new analysis of data that partly we have collected as part of the STOP project. And we have produced new evidence on, for instance, fiscal and regulatory policies. I mean, we have been examining new taxation policies that have been implemented in European countries that have proven to be very effective. I mean, the UK tax on sugar sweetened beverages is one that has an innovative design that has incentivized not just consumers to reduce their consumption of sugar sweetened beverages, but also and especially manufacturers of sugar sweetened beverages to reduce the sugar levels, the sugar content in their beverages. Then we've looked at social marketing interventions. One of the case studies that we have looked at is actually the Drink Up campaign in the United States, which has been very successful in the relatively short term. But we have also found, unfortunately, that after a few years, the impact of the campaign is not detectable anymore. So obviously, there is a need for these types of interventions to be sustained over time in order for them to continue to be effective. Otherwise, the effectiveness, as I say, is somehow lost. Then we've been looking at physical activity and physical education interventions, and I'll show you a diagram on Slovenia in particular in a moment that is, I think, very important as an output of STOP. And we've looked at food reformulation programs, particularly those focusing on sugar, which are not, as I say, looked at in the literature very much. And finally, but I don't have results for this yet because it hasn't finished yet because of disruptions from COVID. We have a randomized controlled trial ongoing in 3 countries, Sweden, Spain, and Romania, in which we're testing a family-based and primary care-led intervention to address obesity in very young children under the age of 5. Let me just show you very briefly before I conclude the effect of physical activity interventions that have been undertaken in Slovenia over a long period of time. Slovenia has a program that is called SlowFit that not only measures, monitors the physical fitness of children, of all children in the country regularly every year, but also provides additional physical education to children that helps them maintain their physical fitness and lower their BMI. And the results of this program, at least in the last 10 years, have been great. If you see the statistics, the obesity statistics, they've been declining steadily in the last 10 years, despite a fairly strong increase up to 2010. But what we have seen, and this is a very important study that has been done by our Slovenian colleagues in STOP, is that the COVID pandemic has reversed dramatically all the gains that had been made in the last 10 years. So the increase in obesity and the reduction in physical fitness for children in Slovenia has been absolutely dramatic, as you can see in this slide. So let me draw some conclusions very briefly. The evidence base on the causes of childhood obesity and ways in which we can address effectively childhood obesity has been evolving rapidly over the past 5 years, and I hope the STOP project has contributed to the increase and the strengthening of that evidence base. There are new and effective solutions that have emerged, like social marketing campaigns, nudges, taxes, front of pack labeling schemes, and so on. But these evidences also taught us that we need to be realistic in our expectations about the effectiveness of these interventions. Individually, these interventions can achieve relatively little, unfortunately. What we really need is to create synergies between these interventions in a coordinated strategy. And this requires, designing these interventions in a coherent way so that they can work with each other and really exploit synergies between different approaches to addressing the problem. I'll stop here. Thank you for paying attention to my presentation. I'd be happy to take your questions, and I'm aware that there is limited time. Of course, you're welcome to follow up by email if you want additional information about the STOP project.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Sassi. It was wonderful to hear about this really unique program that's trying to intervene at so many different levels. We have a couple of questions in the chat. And I did have one question. You mentioned biosamples, like primarily cord blood. I'd imagine there are other types of biosamples that you've collected. And are these samples and data, it sounds like a very rich data set, available in some sort of a repository to other scientists who might want to use them?
Yes, most of the samples are from cohorts, European cohorts that were established before STOP and whose data and samples we have used in STOP research. So all of these cohorts are in principle willing to share their samples or their data with interested researchers. It's a question of, liaising with the individual cohorts. I'm very happy to, act as an intermediary if necessary, of course.
That's great. Thank you. Sonia, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Sassi, for a great presentation. So I was interested in hearing a little bit more about the preconception exposures. So in ECHO here at the NIH, the ECHO program, in the next phase, we're interested in preconception. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about the types of exposures that you're looking at, when, and also are you collecting these exposures in females and males or just the females?
We have these exposures in females and males, fathers and mothers. They tend to be mostly environmental exposures. So characteristics of the environment in which parents used to live before conception and before birth. But they include also some biological characteristics of parents, like, the example I mentioned in one of my slides was about pre-pregnancy BMI of the mother.
Great, thank you. Are these measures available to share?
Yes, they would be. Yeah, they are, as I say, for specific areas. When they are based on environmental exposures, they've been measured in specific areas in Europe. So they're usually regions around the places where the cohorts are based. But this data would be available for sharing. Yes, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have other comments? I know Dr. Bremer wants to make a comment, but I don't think he can unmute himself. Let's see. Mark, is it possible for you to allow Dr. Drew Bremer to make a comment? He's part of our.
Yeah, he is a co-host, so he should be able to do so.
Okay, he says he's being blocked from being unmuted, but let me see if I can.
Okay.
Or you can. Are there? Oh, there's a comment here I see from Dr. Wells. Dr. Wells, do you want to make your comment?
Yes, am I unmuted?
Yes.
I've really enjoyed that talk very much. I just wanted to add a complexity in that we've recently shown that because BMI centiles widen with age, that the distance between the high centile and the median gets bigger with age. What that means is that when an older child has a high BMI centile, they have an awful lot more fat compared to a young child who is also on the 85th centile. So we're not actually looking at a constant definition of obesity by age. And we have a paper just out in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition suggesting that using high BMI centiles in young children is probably over-emphasizing excess body fatness. You're not really seeing body fat as being high in those children in any degree as you are in the older children. So, but that's just going to complicate childhood obesity research.
That's a very interesting point. Thank you.
All right, Drew, if you were.
I think I
there you go.
Fantastic. Sorry, always the troublemaker, Drew. No, Franco, thanks so much. I just, as much as a comment as a question, I just want to really say I appreciate all the work that you and the STOP program is doing, and I think, you know, not only are there lessons learned that your teams are helping us with, but very applicable to other ongoing efforts here domestically, and the National Collaborative on Childhood Obesity Research is just one where there's a lot of synergy. So I just want to say thank you, and I also want to underscore just the nuances, you know, of doing obesity research in the pediatric arena. It's I mean, we always say kiddos aren't small adults, and there are lots of nuances in both research and how the implications of the research move forward, and the policies or just kind of social structures. So again, I just want to reiterate just the importance of you and your team and the work that you're doing, and how applicable it is, you know, certainly to our efforts here in the States. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again. And I'm going to now introduce Dr. Bill Dietz. Dr. Dietz is chair of the Sumner M. Redstone Global Center for Prevention and Wellness at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. From 1997 to 2012, he was the director of the Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity at the CDC. Prior to his appointment to the CDC, Dr. Dietz was a professor of pediatrics at the Tufts University School of Medicine and director of the clinical nutrition at the Floating Hospital of New England Medical Center Hospitals. He's been a counselor and past president of the American Society for Clinical Nutrition and past president of the North American Association for the Study of Obesity, now known as the Obesity Society. In 1998, Dr. Dietz was elected to the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences. In 2002, he was made an honorary member of the American Dietetic Association and received the Holroyd Sherry Award for his outstanding contribution to the field of children, adolescents, and the media. In 2005, he received the George Bray Founders Award from the North American Association for the Study of Obesity. And as director of the Stop Obesity Alliance, he is focused on competencies for obesity providers and the delivery of obesity treatment and prevention in primary care. Dr. Dietz is the author of 300 publications in the scientific literature and the editor of 5 books. And he will be speaking today on the global syndemics of obesity, food and nutrition insecurity, and climate change. Dr. Dietz.
Thank you, Susan. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all today and to be a member of this incredible presentation. So I hope you can see my slides. Is that true? Yes, I hope so. Well, thank you again. My discussion this morning is going to be a bit of a departure from the talks that you've already heard. Because I want to focus on what I consider, and I think are widely considered, the 3 major threats to health of people and the planet. And that includes obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. And the wrinkle here is the addition of COVID-19 and its impact on food and nutrition insecurity. So I want to amplify a bit what Francesco began to talk about, which is the global burden of obesity, diabetes, undernutrition, and climate change. So obesity affects 2 billion people worldwide and costs $2 trillion per year. Diabetes immediately follows that. It's about $500 billion a year. Stunting affects 155 million children, and there are 800 million people with chronic undernutrition. And malnutrition in all its forms accounts for about $3.5 trillion per year. And climate change, which we've named a pandemic, now accounts for 5 to 10% of the world's GDP. And in the figure on the right, you can see that in this upper section, this is an increase in the prevalence of obesity. And as Francesco indicated, this is substantial. And this is, it's important to mention, based on Dr. Sassi's talk, that these data are pre-pandemic. And you can see that down here, there's been a gradual decline in the prevalence of stunting, not as much as we would like, but substantial. So people who are not familiar with the term syndemics, a syndemic, and in this case, we're going to be talking about plural syndemics, are clusters of diseases within a population that have an adverse interaction at both biological and, importantly, biosocial levels. And they are a product of large-scale social forces that precipitate disease clustering, often and importantly, with a disparate impact on marginalized populations. And in 2019, we began this discussion of the global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change in a publication in The Lancet from the Lancet Commission on Obesity. Boyd Swinburne and I were co-chairs of this commission. And we focused on this interaction between undernutrition, obesity, and climate change, which you can see in the figure on the right. And these interactions, it's important to emphasize, are bidirectional. You heard about the double burden of disease of undernutrition and obesity from Francesco Branca. We also know that there are bidirectional interactions between climate change and undernutrition and climate change and obesity, and I'll amplify that in just a moment. Although much of the data that I'm going to present and the viewpoints that I'm going to present are US-centric, it's important to recognize that we in the US are second only to China in the generation of greenhouse gases, and fourth in the per capita generation of greenhouse gases. And therefore, we have a special responsibility in this country to address the whole issue of climate change. So what do these interactions look like? Well, as Francesco pointed out, there's the double burden of obesity and stunting. There's also this interaction of car use, which is associated with reduced activity, which in turn contributes to obesity. The car use increases greenhouse gas emissions, and a reduced yield of crops and micronutrient content of crops is a consequence of increased greenhouse gases emissions, particularly in the developing world, although increasingly that's occurring in this country and developed countries as well. And a combination of all of this contributes to food and nutrition insecurity. And this is an important addition. I think people have focused on food insecurity without recognizing the importance of micronutrient insecurity as well. On the food side, cattle production emits methane. 85% of emissions from agriculture in this country come from methane emissions, which increases greenhouse gases 80 times greater than CO2, and is driven by beef consumption. And beef consumption contributes to obesity, diabetes, colon cancer, and cardiovascular disease. So I hope you can see here that these interactions are in combination, increasing the adverse effects of each. The importance of this approach of looking at syndemics is the opportunity to identify double and triple duty solutions that affect one or more, or two or more of these pandemics simultaneously. So let's look a little bit more closely at the impact of climate change on food and nutrition security and undernutrition. So as I mentioned, increased greenhouse gases certainly increase the uptake of water and increased temperature in the atmosphere, which increases the rainfall variability and leads to flooding, which in turn leads to reduced crop yields, reduced nutrient content, and as a result of those decreases, price increases. And these in turn contribute to food nutrition insecurity and undernutrition. The same thing is true in terms of seafood, on which large numbers of the population, world's population, are dependent. That the rise in ocean temperature and acidification alters fish catch, alters nutrient content, and in turn contributes to food and nutrition insecurity. So this shows in a little more detail these interactions. So central to this is beef production, dairy, and ultra-processed foods. This in turn contributes to climate change and environmental degradation, and these beef production and consumption and dairy production and consumption contribute to obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and colon cancer. In the US, this accounts for about 10% of greenhouse gases. 85% of that 10% is due to beef production and dairy. And it's important to look at these underlying drivers because we tend to focus on beef production as the problem, or dairy or ultra-processed foods, whereas the drivers of these are where we seek to change. And that involves addressing cultural norms, the supply and demand of the food supply, subsidies for commodity crops, price supports, and political power. Whereas, and the solutions, the triple duty actions, are increasing plant-based foods and reducing beef consumption. Now, that's not at all easy because it including externalities in the cost of foods, which we're not currently paying for. Redirecting subsidies for commodity crops and going up against very powerful industries, and developing effective communication strategies to engage and increase demand for alternatives, such as implementing sustainable food labels and sustainable dietary guidelines. On the activity side and physical activity side, this in the US generates about 30% of greenhouse gases. And this is a consequence of our reliance on transport and urbanization, which contributes to physical inactivity, which in turn contributes to obesity and increases the greenhouse gases and contributes to climate change. The drivers here are quite different. So a very important driver is structural racism that impacts the destination or the accessibility of destinations and the distribution of employment and neighborhood design. Our heavy reliance on car culture, which is encouraged by cheap fuel, which is supported by the fossil fuel lobby and subsidies, and the increased exposure to pollutants in low-income communities actually increases the prevalence of obesity. So here are the solutions. Here the solutions are, the triple duty solutions are modal shifts in transportation, again, addressing structural racism to connect jobs to people and implement interconnected and mixed use neighborhoods, and redesign of community infrastructure to support physical activity and transport systems. And the most powerful strategies, which are also the hardest to achieve, are eliminating subsidies for fossil fuel production and increasing the gas tax. The results of this will be increased physical activity, cheaper transport access in underserved communities to healthy food and employment, and lower greenhouse gases from motorized transport, which has a beneficial effect, as I pointed out earlier, on crop yields and production. Those were the syndemics as of 2019. But in 2020, there's a new syndemic, and that's the syndemic of COVID-19 and its interaction with obesity and food insecurity in the United States, and I think worldwide from based on what we know. COVID-19, we know, has an inequitable impact on people with obesity. There's an increased morbidity and an increased stress associated with it. And as a result of COVID-19, inactivity and the reliance on ultra-processed foods. These in turn contribute to food insecurity and inequitable impact among underserved populations. And a consequence of that is the possibility of increased undernutrition and lost wages. So we know, and I think it's now widely appreciated, that COVID-19 increases the hospitalization rates, severity, and disease rates in people with obesity and particularly in Black, Indigenous, and people of color. These populations are disproportionately affected. And this is very much a consequence of social determinants of health. So COVID-19 outcomes are affected by obesity and also by race and ethnicity. And chronic diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and hypertension all contribute to severe COVID-19 outcomes. And these are particularly affected by the social determinants of health in the United States, and I suspect elsewhere. Things like structural racism, inequitable healthy food access, increased reliance on ultra-processed foods, which we know increases the frequency of obesity and other chronic diseases, inequitable access to healthcare, overcrowded housing, poor working conditions. these are social determinants, and it's not enough to focus exclusively on vaccines without, in addition, focusing on these important determinants. So a second effect of this syndemic was the increase in food and nutrition insecurity, secondary to the food supply and supply chain failures, increased food prices, job losses, and inflation. So we know that in the US and elsewhere, there was a marked increase in food insecurity beginning with the onset of the pandemic in March. And interestingly enough, and surprisingly enough, there's a paradoxical effect that people with an increased BMI are also more likely to experience food insecurity. And as you can see here in this study, non-Hispanic Black populations and Hispanic populations have an increased risk of increased food insecurity as a consequence. So this is an important driver of an important, not just driver, but also a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was particularly apparent in this COVID-19 obesity and food insecurity pandemic that the food supply was highly vulnerable and contributed to food and nutrition insecurity, the double burden of disease and susceptibility to COVID-19. And that's shown here. So as I mentioned earlier, the effects of COVID-19 on the lockdown reduced activity, increased reliance on ultra-processed foods, and food insecurity, increased stress and susceptibility to COVID-19. But this was a consequence in turn of the maltreatment, if you will, of the essential workforce in the United States, who suffer poor living conditions, poor nutrition, low wages, and the lack of personal protection equipment, particularly in the fields and in meat processing plants. That disrupted the food supply chain because of decreased harvesting, decreased processing, decreased availability, and decreased access to healthy alternatives. So this was, these were in turn driven by deeper drivers. This appeared to be the problem, but in fact, the problem was much more a consequence of structural racism, this built-in factors that contributed to poor living conditions, poor nutrition, low wages, a limitation on immigration policy in the United States, and importantly, the priority of profit over health in the food processing plants. So what are the triple duty solutions here for the COVID-19 obesity and food nutrition insecurity syndemic? Well, first of all, stabilization of the food supply chain. Although COVID-19 seems like a unique event, the catastrophic effects of climate change are going to have a recurrent effect on this availability of food and the food chain. And so addressing and the stabilization of the food supply chain means that we need to address the structural racism, the built-in factors that need to be addressed to improve worker conditions in terms of housing, coverage, wages, protective equipment. But it also points to the need to build and strengthen local and regional resilient and sustainable plant-based food systems. Here, the changes that will improve health will also improve climate change. And I think that we already recognize that local and regional food systems may be much more agile in terms of change than the industrialized food system that we now have. And importantly, because ultra-processed foods contribute 65% of calories in the diets of children and adults, we need to reduce reliance on ultra-processed foods. And we're only beginning to understand the impact of the production of ultra-processed foods on climate change. The final lesson to be learned from this most recent syndemic is the lockdown increased childhood obesity. And Dr. Sassi indicated this was true in Slovenia. But here are some data from the US. And what I'm showing here is in this column and these are studies from Dr. Wu, the annual increase in obesity during the COVID-19 pandemic in these groups was like 3%, 9%, 10%, pretty high. And I've compared this this increase in these data sets to the average increase in NHANES for the average annual increase. And over here, you can see just how huge that excess in the annual increase in obesity as a consequence of COVID-19 is compared to what we might expect. And that the biggest effect was in, was in 6 to 11-year-olds, as opposed to these older groups, although these were also substantial. And the concern here is that the pandemic has been associated with marked increases in the prevalence of type 2 diabetes, 77 to almost 300% in 4 or 5 studies that I was able to review. And that these increases were associated with an increased prevalence of diabetic ketoacidosis and higher hemoglobin A1C levels, and that Black and Hispanic children were disproportionately affected. When tested, very few of these children were CoV-2 positive, but interestingly enough, none of these studies really pointed out the impact of increased weight gain on this population. So in closing, I think that the need is to really come to grips and begin to address these syndemics as syndemics and to seek the double and triple solutions. This is going to require political will and change, but it's essential that we undertake that challenge. And finally, given the impact of pandemic weight gain and the impact of obesity, we must be alert to the potential of a new syndemic of obesity, food insecurity, and diabetes in the pediatric age group. So thank you. I hope I've left time for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. That was a wonderful talk, but very sobering. And, you know, it can feel overwhelming, I think, to see all of the major types of changes we need to address this. And as you mentioned, you know, some of it requires political will, and I'm not sure if that is there right now. Can you identify any low-hanging fruit, things that you think might be more amenable to addressing to get us in the right direction?
Well, I think that Gen Z and younger people are showing us the way. That I think we're seeing behavior changes in those groups, and avoidance of meat or reductions in meat or increases in vegetarian diets. I think that the harder lift, I actually think the dietary lift is easier than the physical activity lift, which requires changes in the design of communities to increase physical activity. I think that the other, I wouldn't say mistake, but I think as we emphasize obesity, that we may not have the same audience or the same impact when we talk about these changes as we potentially do if we talk about climate change. I see climate change and a focus on climate change as the way into reducing obesity, rather than an exclusive focus on obesity as a way of altering climate change.
That's interesting. Thank you, Bill. We have a question from Cynthia Stevens in the audience. What is the cause of food insecurity in people with obesity?
I wish I knew. To me, that was a very surprising kind of study. And it was a reputable study published in JAMA. I don't know. I mean, I'm better equipped to answer the question of why 6 to 11-year-olds seem disproportionately affected, and I think that was a consequence of the loss of school meals, and we know that children in poverty who consume school meals had a decrease in the prevalence of obesity up until about 2018, and then that's been displaced by the pandemic. But I'm open to other ideas, and if you've got suggestions about why people with obesity are increasingly food insecure, I'd love to hear them. That's an area that I don't understand.
Thank you. Drew, I think you had something you wanted to say or ask?
Yeah, no, thanks, Bill. Now that I can unmute myself, I won't be quiet. No, but Bill, thank you, and I just want to reiterate it was something that you also brought up, which you also wrote in your papers, just to kind of not just a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach, but really engage the engagement of multiple stakeholders and sectors. And to your point about the younger generations already making choices, which in of themselves may have a small impact, and in aggregate can hopefully help move the needle. So I appreciate that more after reading your paper, just about the multiple angles in addressing these conditions and how they all interplay one to another, just as you just mentioned about the intersection of obesity and climate change, which Lori also is going to ask you to expound on. But I think it was nice to see the not just one approach to these problems, but the kind of the multi-sectorial approach.
Great. I'm going to read a couple of questions from Lori Donzi. She has two here. One is, how can we strengthen reliance on sustainable plant-based food systems? How is this being done locally in the DC area? And also, if you could expand a little bit about what you just said about focusing on climate change first, rather than focusing on obesity itself.
Well, at the heart of your question and the heart of the solution, I think, is an increase in plant-based diets. I think that people, when they hear that, I think we need a better term for that, because I think when people hear that, they're thinking about watercress or something like that. But I think that we've been exploring strategies within DC, and one of the important strategies that I think we can implement as a policy to increase the purchasing, the city's purchasing, or the DC's purchasing of healthy foods, healthy sustainable foods. And there's a bill that just passed council in the last session that mandated that 25% of DC's food purchases be sustainably produced by 2025. That's a big step, and in general, procurement policies are an important way to begin to change behavior, and that we've also seen that both before I left CDC and now. CDC is working on improving this at the federal level, because for federal employees. So that's one policy solution. The issue of local and regional systems for the DC metropolitan area is a little more difficult, because DC and its immediate suburbs don't have the capacity to produce the food that is consumed in this area. So we need a wider radius for that. And one of the models for how to do that is emerging from New York State, which has been really a pioneer in pursuing the regional food distribution. That's not for every that won't work for every region in the United States, but I think it would work here, because we straddle both north and south very productive agricultural systems. And the popularity, as you probably know, of farmers markets has grown dramatically, and the number of farmers markets has grown dramatically. So the demand is there. Whether production can meet that demand and meet it at a price and an access point that affects underserved populations, like here in the district, Ward 7 and 8, which are predominantly African American, predominantly poor. How we meet that group is going to be critical in how we address the whole issue of food insecurity and health. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. And there is another comment from Cynthia Stevens just saying, and I'm sure you will agree, it's difficult to sustain a plant-based lifestyle in places with food deserts.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, but I think I'm not quite sure what the system is eventually going to look like, but I think it's going to be a hybrid of a national food chain as well as local. And if I think from the health point of view, if we can convert the relative contribution of the national industrialized food system to more of a local and regional and sustainable food system, that's going to lead to solutions. That is a solution.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Dietz, and I want to thank all of our speakers from this morning. Dr. Wells did arrive later and is going to be giving his talk. I would suggest we take a 5-minute break. For those who can stay on, I think it's going to be a very fascinating talk. I know I'm looking forward to it. And we will see you all in 5 minutes. Hello, it is 12:35, so we can get started on our final talk today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Wells. He's a professor of anthropology and pediatric nutrition at UCL Great Ormond Street Institute of Child and Health in the UK. He received a BA in social anthropology and a master's in philosophy and biological anthropology and a PhD in biological anthropology and human nutrition from the University of Cambridge. He is a biological anthropologist specializing in research on the developmental origins of adult health and disease, with particular interests in infant and child nutrition, breastfeeding, growth, body composition, childbirth, social inequality, and evolutionary public health. He contributes to cohort studies and randomized trials of nutritional interventions across South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. He led a Lancet series on evolutionary public health in 2017 and has published 2 books with Cambridge University Press. Dr. Wells will be speaking today on the evolution of human adiposity and obesity. Where did it all go wrong? Dr. Wells?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I hope my slides are live, and I do apologize for missing my slot earlier. Thank you so much for your patience in staying for this talk. So this is my title, The Evolution of Human Adiposity and Obesity, Where Did It All Go Wrong? But I could have given a shorter talk, The Evolution of Human Adiposity, What a Success Story. And what I want to try and get across in this presentation is that it's when our complex adipose tissue biology meets environmental perturbations that we end up with a state of obesity. We really need to understand more about what our body fat does in a state of health to understand why it goes wrong. So early evolutionary approaches to obesity emphasize the concept of thrift. We have 2 particularly influential papers, James Neal's thrifty genotype hypothesis from 1962, which suggested that perhaps some people had an elevated susceptibility to obesity based on their ancestors' exposure to cycles of feast and famine. And then in 1992, Nick Hales and David Barker gave us the thrifty phenotype hypothesis, the notion that those exposed to undernutrition in early life might make plastic responses. And again, one of those responses might be an elevated susceptibility to obesity. Now, what do we mean, though, by thrift? Because it's actually a very useful term, but it probably needs a bit more definition. So thrift can be considered to be some form of metabolic prosperity arising from frugality, the careful management of metabolic resources. And there are actually many different forms of thrift. An organism could reduce its energy expenditure. It could be smaller. It could have less expensive organs, but it could also demonstrate physiological processes such as torpor or hibernation. And in fact, the Western jumping mouse shown on the right here can hibernate up to 10 months of the year. So it really compresses its active life into a very short period, saves a lot of energy. So storing energy as body fat is just one component of thrift, and it's helpful to look across this wider range of phenotypes. So we can think about thrift and fat, but really there's much more to thrift than just storing energy as fat. And there's certainly much more to body fat than simply the notion of thrift. And above all, there's much more to body fat than what we've learned by looking at it through the lens of obesity research. So to understand the biology of living organisms, evolutionary biologists use a theory called life history theory. And this theory simplifies our understanding of metabolism to treat energy as a scarce resource for any organism. All organisms must then invest their energy across competing functions, which are defined as maintenance, growth, defense, and reproduction. More energy to one function means less for the others. And the conventional view is that organisms allocate their energy on moment-by-moment decisions. They're always allocating more energy here and less energy there. And then the idea is that the optimal energy allocation strategy should vary depending on the age and the sex of the organism, its nutritional status, and the state of the environment. Now, if we store, we get to delay those decisions, and that helps us allocate energy more successfully. Now, the drive to store energy from body fat may come, as we saw earlier, from two different sources. Our ancestors may have maximized their reproductive fitness by storing energy and left in the genome some kind of instructions to have higher levels of body fat. But then, based on our experience during the life course, we may also end up accumulating higher levels of body fat. And in each case, that allows energy to be preserved so that it can be allocated to improve fitness or maximize fitness, depending on the state of the environment and age and so on. What kind of environment shaped our metabolism, both in terms of our genetics and our ability to make plastic responses? Well, if we look back at the last 5 billion years, the main signal that we see in the climate of the Earth is that it became cooler. And we know that that was very influential for human evolution. We know that the savanna environment spread in Africa, and that's where we think that both the Homo genus and our own species evolved. And we know that we have quintessential traits such as being a bipedal organism, having a large brain, being social, having hands with opposable thumbs, and so on. So we might think that our higher levels of body fat and our simply another trait associated with this cooler savanna environment. But actually, if we look back in more detail at the climate record, we see something beyond the trends to the Earth getting cooler. And that's that the climate started oscillating to larger degrees, as you can see by the magnitude of these bars here. So actually, human evolution took place in an environment of growing ecological volatility. That applies to the evolution of the Homo genus around 2 million years ago, and then our own species emergence around 200,000 years ago. So you could say that the hominins that we are or we're descended from actually evolved in response to being successful at addressing ecological volatility. So we are actually a thrifty species, and this is about much more than our body fat. Compared to other primates, we have higher levels of body fat, but also less lean mass. We're sort of under-muscled, especially among females. We show a slowed pattern of childhood growth. And what that means is that we've distributed our costs of growth across a much longer period of time. We show cooperative breeding. We help each other socially. And that means that it reduces the cost of reproduction for individual women. And so our complex adipose tissue biology is all part of that wider phenotype of thrift amongst humans. But I think the adipose tissue biology is particularly important, and I would say it's just as important as our large brains in explaining why we've been a successful species from an evolutionary point of view. We have a very unusual life course profile of adiposity. This schematic diagram puts relative fatness, so that's fat adjusted for height on the y-axis, and relative lean mass on the x-axis. And you can see that humans start with a certain level of fat at birth. We gain a lot during infancy, but then we lose it during childhood. And then during adolescence, the two sexes diverge so that males accumulate more lean mass and relatively less fat, and females accumulate relatively more fat and less lean. And that gives us the adult sexual dimorphism that we're all so familiar with. If we think about the genetic component of human adiposity, family studies indicate a medium level of heritability, but twin studies and adoption studies both indicate a relatively high heritability of body fatness. But we must also remember that those studies are conducted in environments largely where it's possible to see a lot of variability in body fat. Those studies have told us that body fatness is a highly polygenetic trait. It involves many different alleles, but each allele tends to have a relatively small magnitude of effect on a trait such as BMI. So where did that genetic variability come from? Well, there must have been a lot of genetic variability in the Homo genus prior to the origin of our own species, but because we have quite a bit of information about our speciation event, and it was involved a relative bottleneck, not much of that genetic variability could have passed into our own species. So our own genetic variability is much more likely to have been shaped during the dispersal of early Homo sapiens individuals around Africa, and then also after the exodus from Africa. And during this period, there may have been some interbreeding with other species of hominins, which could have brought in different sources of genetic variability. But I think we should also pay a lot of attention to the origins of agriculture for two reasons. One is that this period saw rapid increases in population size, and therefore increasing the natural rate of mutations, just throwing more variability into the genetic mix. And then agriculture has also seen us occupy a wider range of subsistence niches, and therefore there could have been both selective pressures and also intergenerational effects that could have amplified such genetic variability. On the other hand, if we look at human genetic variability in general, we see something really interesting. On this diagram, the size of the trees indicates the magnitude of genetic variability in the species. And you can see for the red tree for humans that it's pretty much the same size as the yellow tree for chimpanzees and the green and blue trees for Western chimpanzees and bonobos. And what that means is that humans have occupied a very wide range of ecological niches without showing large degrees of genetic differentiation. And we know that very well, but it's always important to remind us that we're a successful species ecologically without showing a lot of genetic adaptation. So if we think about the genetics of adiposity, we can say that they're adiposity alleles because they correlate with BMI, but that's probably a slightly inappropriate way to look at these alleles. Actually, they're alleles that are embedded in many different aspects of phenotype and metabolism relating to diet, cognition, reproduction, defense against pathogens and predators, but also social stresses, growth and thermoregulation. And these alleles are partly about helping us adapt to favorable environments, but they're also alleles that help us avoid doing badly. They help us survive and reproduce in tough environments. So we know that we've occupied the vast majority of the global landmass, and that means that humans have been exposed to many different ecological environments and subsistence systems, partly through developing agriculture and so on. And yet, as I said, that hasn't involved high degrees of genetic differentiation, but that doesn't mean it hasn't been very important for human biology. An organism that can tolerate stochastic environments can colonize new environments and become exposed to new stresses. But what that favors is an enhanced capacity to make plastic responses to short-term stresses. And then those organisms are able to cope with a wider range of ecological variability, and they can continue to colonize. So the way that we colonize the Earth's land masses hasn't led to genetic differentiation, but what it probably has done has ramped up our phenotypic plasticity. And that appears particularly important in understanding why our adipose tissue biology is so susceptible to modern obesogenic stresses. So I'd like to suggest that body fat represents a very sophisticated kind of risk management physiological system. It buffers against ecological stresses, but it also helps regulate reproduction and growth and different forms of defense. We can think of fat as a generalized energy currency that can detach the strategy of allocating energy across different physiological functions from the basic ongoing in and out dynamics, the food we eat, the activity that we perform. We can convert a lot of different raw materials, either foods or social help, into a common unit, energy stored in body fat. And that fat can then much more effectively allocate energy selectively between different physiological functions. Now, interestingly, body fat is not the only generalized energy currency that humans use. We also have social capital. So physical capital, body fat stores, and social capital both allow us to store energy in fat and social relationships, respectively. And each of these forms of capital allow us to allocate energy over time to optimize fitness. It's a bit like being able to store your salary in a bank account rather than having to spend it immediately every time it's paid to you. Why would we benefit from both social and somatic energy stores or somatic insurance? Well, some risks affect individuals. So one individual could fail to forage successfully and obtain enough food. But that could be compensated by social insurance if other members of the social group share some of their food or other resources. But there are other risks that affect the whole group, such as famine. And then an individual may only survive if it's actually stored some energy in the body. So that's body fat and personal insurance. You can see here how ongoing capacities to resolve ecological fluctuations are addressed by body fat stores. So the top line shows just the change in ecological conditions over different timescales. Those changes put an organism temporarily either in positive or negative energy balance. And as a result of that, energy stores in body fat fluctuate over time. So the body fat stores smooth over these changing ecological conditions. Now, we know that body fat is particularly important for accommodating severe starvation. And if we look at what happens during starvation, you can see that the biggest change amongst all the body tissues is in adipose tissue. And that's not surprising. It's a store of energy. That's what it's designed to do, to some extent. But you can also see that many of the other tissues also decline in association with famine. So fat is merely the most efficient tissue. But there's been, I think it's generally accepted that there's been far too much emphasis on famine as supposedly the key selective pressure shaping our body fatness. Actually, famine is just one stress and may have been particularly important in recent times following the emergence of agriculture. There are many other stresses that affect many humans. These are data from female Gambian farmers in West Africa, and these are the annual fluctuations in body weight. You can see the average high point and low point of the population across the years. On average, there's a 3 kilogram fluctuation between higher body weight and lower body weight, but in the worst years, this can be as much as a 5 kilogram fluctuation. And that fluctuation in weight is basically mostly made up of changes in body fat. So losing and gaining fat is how these women accommodate the fact that sometimes they're working very hard, but there's not a lot to eat. At other times, they don't need to work hard, but they've got their harvest. Adiposity may be also particularly important during some periods of growth, and that may particularly apply to the high levels of body fat in infancy. During infancy, the brain is a relatively high proportion of body weight, and it's an expensive tissue, and therefore it's a very high proportion of total body basal metabolism, and also is the main issue for glucose requirements. So the brain needs a permanent supply of fuel, and if it can't get adequate glucose, it can metabolize ketones from body fat. So it's been suggested that high levels of body fat in infancy are there to buffer the brain from potential undernutrition in early life and make sure it gets its fuel supply. Body fat's also important for female reproduction. I could have several slides on this, but I just want to have one, which is that you can see here that the sum of skin folds declines in reproductive women in New Guinea with increasing months per partum. And that's evidence that body fat is playing a role in contributing to the energetic funding of lactation. We know also that because women reproduce early in adult life and then stop reproducing, that the body fat would have a different metabolic value. And you can see that here. The ratio of the thigh circumference to the hip circumference declines after the 40s, whereas the ratio of waist circumference to BMI increases after the 40s. What that means is that body fat is literally being shifted around the body as its function for reproduction fades away, and instead body fat becomes more important for survival, and that implicates abdominal fat, which is particularly important for immune function. However, men show no such shape changes because they don't use their fat for reproduction. Here you can see a very strong association between BMI and body fat in men, but really very little variability in that depending on men's age. Adiposity is also very important for immune function. It meets the costs of infections by funding immune defense of tissues. It contributes to the repair of tissue damage. It pays some of the metabolic costs of fever. It's involved in the production of lymphocytes, antibodies, and so on. And ironically, of course, we have to fund the growth and metabolism of any pathogen that's inside us. So body fat really plays a key role in immune function, providing both the energy and the molecular precursors and immune agents. And all of those have metabolic costs. This is just one example of the value of body fat, not just in supplying energy, but also in producing immunoagents. These are data from children with severe acute malnutrition, and you can see that those who unfortunately died were those with the lowest leptin levels. Now, leptin is a hormone that acts as a gateway for activating immune function. So what you can see here is it's the children who weren't able to signal to their immune function the availability of energy that unfortunately died. But one interesting issue is the possibility that the way that body fat contributes to immune function might vary depending on the diseases that are likely to affect humans. And I've been interested in the idea that different human populations and different geographical regions might actually have both a different distribution of body fat and also a different metabolic activity. For example, if we think of a red blood cell pathogen like the malaria parasite, that might place selective pressure on the magnitude and metabolic profile of intramuscular adipose tissue, which generates the fever, which is a primary defense against malaria. However, a gut pathogen such as cholera might put much more selective pressure on the magnitude and metabolic profile of visceral adipose tissue. Now, this is just an idea, but it could give rise to the possibility that there may be ethnic differences both in the regional distribution of adipose tissue and in, for example, the cytokine activity. This could arise either through genetic adaptation, but it could also arise through plastic responses elicited in the life course simply to being exposed to different infectious diseases. Where this might be particularly interesting is that could give rise to ethnic differences in the form of inflammation in association with obesity following exposure to nutrition transition. So that's immune response, how the body deals with pathogens and other species, but we also have social stresses emerging from our own species. And we know that the stress response is associated with increased appetite and weight gain. I just wanted to show here data from a short-term experiment that we did on young men with overweight. We randomly allocated them to either watch TV or play a video game without violent content or one with violent content. The video games activated the stress response. And you can see here that in a test meal after the intervention, those who'd watched Call of Duty, the violent video game, consumed significantly more sweet foods and foods with a high fat content compared to those who'd watched TV. So overall, we can think of metabolism as an energy allocation game. The body gets in some energy through food intake and has to allocate it either to storing it in tissues, functional tissues such as the brain or the organs, or a fuel depot such as glycogen or adipose tissue, or the calorie can be expended on a function such as maintenance or tissue synthesis. And how we play this game for any human depends on our life course traits, our age, our sex, whether we're reproducing or not, and also in association with the quality of the environment, the ecological conditions, our food supply, our pathogens, our social stresses, and so on. And then how we play that game is conducted through many different metabolic signals. And here we see all the hormones that we're interested in when we try and understand the association of obesity with ill health. Insulin, leptin, resistin, adiponectin, and so on. But very importantly, many of these signals are emitted by body fat and act on other tissues or on other physiological systems. So that means that I think we should think of the body as having a two-tier system of risk management. Of course, we have the brain, which deals with short-term stresses. For example, if we see a predator, we get a single acute signal that we need to do something now, and the brain activates the stress response, and that triggers behavioral and physiological responses to deal with that stress. But we have many other longer-term stresses that are impacting on us: our supply of food, our demands for physical activity or the lack of it, any burden of infectious disease, and any short or long-term social stresses. And those stresses generate metabolic signals going into the body, and they have implications for our energy balance, but also they target adipose tissue, and adipose tissue responds with its own signals that go back and influence many aspects of our metabolism. So body fat is an amazing part of human biology and really helps us survive. And so if that's also great, why is it all going so wrong? Why do we have a global obesity epidemic? So we know, and you've heard many talks today that alludes to these issues, that there are ongoing secular trends that collectively constitute an obesogenic niche. We're changing our diet, we have new or reduced or higher risks of infection, we have vaccination, but also new pathogens. We're reproducing in new ways, smaller family size, we're changing our physical activity, exposed to environmental pollutants and toxins, we're changing our thermal environment, we're changing our circadian rhythms, and we're certainly changing all sorts of different aspects of social stress. Now, these would be trends in their own right, but one thing they all have in common is that they are susceptible to commercial interests. So we have to remember that when we see these changes, they aren't just about individuals voluntarily making decisions. They also emerge under the broader structure of society where there are other interests. Now, it's just one example of how I think we really need to shift our understanding of what's going on with body fat and obesity. A lot of people are questioning the utility of the energy balance framework for looking at the causes of obesity. The energy balance framework has taught us that obesity occurs because we have positive energy balance due to energy intake being high and energy expenditure on physical activity being low. That positive energy balance then leads to fat deposition, weight gain, and all the associated health problems. And the public health message has been to count the calories that we consume and to make sure that we burn more calories than we consume by being physically active. But many people have become dissatisfied by this by realizing that there are other ways that we can think about energy balance, obesity, and different potential causes. One alternative focuses on a diet high in refined carbohydrate, which can perturb our insulin dynamics. But we can also look at physical activity in the same way. If we are physically inactive, that leads to a state of metabolic inflexibility where we're not good at drawing on our body fat stores for energy, and that also contributes to higher insulin. So then these factors drive fat deposition, and the positive energy balance is simply a symptom that we see. It's not actually the cause of obesity, it's just something that co-occurs with it. And the high insulin levels could actually produce some of the things that we think cause obesity, such as lethargy and hunger. So this turns everything around. And now the public health message would be avoid eating refined carbohydrate and get fit to boost metabolic flexibility. Now that's just one example, but I think what that suggests is that to really understand obesity, we need to understand all the different ways that we're perturbing our behavior and perturbing our adipose tissue. We can think about different social norms that influence our behavior, the way that many of our decisions are made automatically for us, things like supermarket layouts, TV advertising, and so on. And then we can think of the way that our metabolism is directly influenced by nutrient content, stimulants that are also addictive, and then behaviors that also trigger addictive pathways in the brain. So that's all I wanted to say. I wanted to mention two books that I wrote which are really designed to encourage people to think or question more and look for new avenues to explore in the context both of our body fatness, but also the structure of society. And this really echoes many of what Professor Dietz said in his talk, that it's the structure of society where I think we really would find the real causes of the obesity epidemic and the syndemics that he referred to. So if you stayed with me for this talk, thank you so much for being here, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Wells. That was a fascinating talk. And I think, Drew, it sounds like you have a comment or question.
See, you let me unmute and I just don't go away. No, Jonathan, thanks for joining, and we really appreciate you being available today. And it's more of a comment, because I'm intrigued by your work, but also with your comments about the varying degrees of adiposity and and tissue fat distribution in women geographically and amongst ethnicities, how that may then impact lactation and human milk composition in these populations of women, and then how that may actually influence lactocrine programming. And we talk a lot about in utero programming, but post birth lactocrine programming is another element that's gaining more attention.
Yeah, I think that there are schools of science that really focus just on human variability, but there's something of a disconnect between understanding the normal variability, the adaptive variability. It's still somewhat separated from obesity research, where the emphasis is on what happens when everything's gone wrong. And the more that we can join those two fields together, the more we probably would understand the beneficial side of body fat and how it's being perturbed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to again thank all of our speakers and the people who attended this symposium. We do hope to make recordings of the talks available in case anyone missed some of them. And we will send that information out to the people who registered for this course, for this symposium when we have received it. Thanks again to everyone and have a good rest of the day.